Tyranny of Steel. Author Zentmeister. Chapters 16 to 28. Chapter 16. Harsh Mistress. Lambert lied shirtless, bound, and prostrate on the floor of his fiancée's bedchamber. A peerless beauty with a flawless heart-shaped face and silky strawberry blonde hair cascading down her shoulders gazed coldly at her foolish fiancé with her sky-blue eyes. She was currently in the process of punishing. Her foot pressed his head down into the cold stone floor while her left hand carried a curled whip. Her heavenly bust heaved as she sighed in disappointment at the news of failure in which Lambert had brought her. Lind von Habsburg was the eldest daughter of Count Lothar von Habsburg, head of House von Habsburg-Innsbruck, which was a cadet branch of House von Habsburg whose main branch were the rulers of the Duchy of Austria. She was 16 this year and was renowned across the duchy as one of the three heavenly beauties of Austria. However, looks were often deceiving. Personality-wise, Lind was secretly a sadistic bitch known among a select few as a young woman who broke her toys easily. Yes, her toys, that was how she referred to her suitors, many of which had come and gone over the years as they could not endure the physical and mental abuse which she took pleasure in inflicting upon them. Lambert was just the newest arrival, and though her father had supported his proposal, she did not personally recognize it. An intense gaze stared down upon the teenage boy lying prostrate before her as she raised her whip and struck his back. A large cut appeared as it made contact with his flesh. Lambert desperately attempted not to let a painful cry escape his lips, however, he could not resist screaming in agony after another 2 lashes. Which only further enraged the dominatrix, who pressed his head further into the cold stone floor with the heel of her foot. If Lambert gazed up, he would be able to clearly see the beautiful girl's embroidered white silk panties that lie beneath her sinful baby blue nightgown, which had been purposely designed to show off the girl's immaculate curves. However, it would only further provoke his fiancée if he did so, something he would do his best to avoid. After venting her frustration on the youth's body, she sighed heavily and lowered the whip before bringing Lambert's face up to meet her own vicious glare. Tears streamed from the boy's eyes as she chastised him for his weakness. "It looks like frailty runs in your family, how pathetic." The girl got up from the bed and kicked Lambert back down to the ground as she sat on his back, using him as a stool for her to rest on. "You're useless, you know that?" After hearing about Lambert's attempt on his elder brother's life which failed spectacularly, she was in a particularly foul mood. Exactly how hard was it to poison a sickly and frail man to death? Somehow not only did Lambert's attempt fail, but it inspired Berengar to get his act together and began the process of becoming healthy. By now, the young lord had overcome his childhood infirmity, thus ruining her and her father's plans. The news was even worse as they found out that the Count of Steiermark had engaged his third and youngest daughter to Berengar, thus giving them a greater stake in Kufstein's rich iron reserves. If they could not remove Berengar within the next few years and place Lambert as the sole heir to the barony, then this engagement was entirely useless for the Counts of Tyrol. Lambert struggled to endure the weight of his fiancée, who sat atop his back. Nevertheless, he managed as she continued to scold him, though at the moment, she was more speaking to herself than anything else. "If you want something done right, you've got to do it yourself." The heavenly beauty saw her toy gazing up at her and looked at him with disgust. She grabbed a hold of the handle of her whip and shoved it in the boy's mouth, forcing his head away with a violent thrust. "Do not set your filthy gaze upon me, wastrel. You have not earned that right." Lambert averted his gaze as he forced himself to ask the question on his mind. "Apologies, mistress, I was just curious about what you said. What is your plan exactly?" A wicked grin appeared across the immaculate visage of the sinister beauty as she gazed down at her favorite toy, sending chills down his spine. "Isn't it obvious? I'm going to go back to your home and seduce your brother, then, after he is on his knees begging, I will end his life. Clearly, you can't be trusted to do this simple task yourself." Lambert felt conflicted after hearing such words. His fiancée was going to seduce his brother? Even after enduring all this abuse, Lambert had not even been able to sleep with her yet. The lustful teenage boy was extremely envious of his older brother at the current moment, but as he thought about the pain he was currently facing, his mind shifted to joy instead. If she was like this with her fiancé, how cruel would she be to Berengar when she finally got him on his knees? Without awaiting her fiancé's approval, Lind called out in an authoritative tone, "Hans." Immediately the door to the bedchamber swung open, and a young knight clad in full-plated armor with a sword slung around his waist entered the room and knelt before the young lady. Evidently he was well accustomed to the sight before him, as not a hint of surprise could be seen from his expression. "Yes, my lady?" Lind sat atop Lambert's back with her arms crossed and an indifferent expression. She did not care for someone as low as a knight. As the privileged daughter of a count, she even considered barons to be nothing more than elevated trash, let alone a common knight. "Get my shit packed, I'm going to Kufstein." Hans would never disobey an order from the young lady. He did not want to end up in Lambert's current position. As such, he obeyed her orders, despite it being a menial task unbefitting of a knight. He was well aware that a servant was a servant in the eyes of the harsh mistress, and there was nothing he could do about that. "Your will is my command." Afterward, the knight quickly left the room and went to manage the task set before him. It would be a matter of hours before she set forth on the road to Kufstein with a retinue of knights to protect her and her current boy-toy in tow. Meanwhile, in Kufstein, Berengar had just finished his daily breakfast and set forth on the task to begin constructing his irrigation system, which was based on a system used in his previous life commonly referred to as wheel line irrigation. In his previous life, this irrigation system provided water to vast fields across the entirety of the United States of America. With this system in place, the Barony of Kufstein would efficiently water their many crops without the need for several farmers to water them by hand. Eventually, this would allow for fewer farmers while utilizing larger plots of land for growing crops. When Berengar entered the industrial district, he saw his friend and partner in the steel industry, Ludwig, currently overseeing steel production. When the old man noticed the young lord approach, he bowed respectfully. "My lord, it is wonderful to see you. I have been awaiting your instructions on what to do with all this fine steel we have amassed." Berengar smiled and mocked his friend in a jestful manner. "Oh, I thought my father visited you yesterday. Did the Baron not have any plans for the resources of his domain?" Ludwig scratched his head with an awkward smile on his face as he led Berengar over to the storehouse which currently contained all of the steel, briefly summarizing his discussion with the young lord's father the day prior. "Ultimately, I managed to convince him to let you manage the steel business. He was so shocked by the amount of steel in our stockpile that he had no idea what to do with it all." Berengar chuckled. If he were in his father's position, he would be a bit overwhelmed as well. "A wise move. We'll sell between 3 to 5 tons of it. I am certain that in these uncertain times, there is bound to be a buyer for that much steel." Ludwig scratched his beard while entertaining the thought. "What about the rest?" Berengar had a look of excitement in his eyes as he stretched out the blueprints for his irrigation system. Though it looked complicated at first glance, Ludwig quickly realized the ingenious nature of the design. "This is for watering crops?" the old man asked, almost in disbelief that such a thing could exist. Berengar nodded in affirmation of the statement and looked off into the distant fields of Kufstein with a determined expression on his face. "Imagine it, all of our fields supplied with water through this system, not a single patch of land unquenched." Ludwig looked off into the fields, which were filled with farmers slowly watering their crops by hand. He could envision the future quite well, but a concern instantly entered his mind. "Won't that put a lot of farmers out of work?" Berengar smiled at Ludwig and grabbed a hold of his shoulder. "Out of the fields and into the factories. Of course, they will be properly compensated for their labor." After hearing the extent of Berengar's thought process, Ludwig could not help but share in the feeling of excitement that these blueprints had generated. Truly, Berengar had a mind like no other. The fact that he had used the word factories proved that the young lord's ambitions for the steel industry did not end with this one factory they had just built. Ludwig was slowly starting to piece together Berengar's concept of an industrialized society. The more designs the young lord showed him, the more his understanding of the world changed. After chatting a bit more about his plans, Berengar finally allowed Ludwig to work on the irrigation system. It would take a while to produce it, but he figured it could be done in a matter of months. At most, in half a year, the fields of Kufstein would be properly irrigated, ushering in a new age of agriculture. By then, he hoped to have some of his mechanized inventions in production, like the combine harvester, seeder, as well as the steel plow. Now that he had accomplished his plans for the day Berengar returned to the castle, it was about time he began making preparations to befriend the local nobility. As such, he went back to his room and began drafting invitations for the minor lords and knights under his father's vassalage, as well as their families. After all, he had an excuse to host a party. He had recently gotten engaged to a fine young woman, and it was time to throw an official celebration and allow the world to know of his intent to marry her. Initially, he had reservations about the idea of marrying his cousin. After all, that was not a common thing in his previous life. In American society, it was outright outlawed throughout most of the country. However, Adela proved to be beyond his expectations. He honestly did not have many expectations for the young girl to begin with. At the very least, he figured she would be a noble snob who would chastise him for his friendliness with the commoners. Yet, she proved to be a kind-hearted young girl who thus far had appreciated the culture he had begun to foster in Kufstein. Maybe one day soon, he could share his vision for the future of his domain with her. Even if something happened and the engagement did not work out, he still needed an excuse to gather his father's vassals, and this was the best one he could come up with. By refusing to show, they would not be insulting him, but his father, the Baron. Something the lesser nobles beneath his rule could very well not afford. While he was drafting up the letters of invitation, Berengar heard a knock on the door. As such, he placed down his quill into the ink bottle and investigated the disturbance. After opening the door, he was surprised to see Adela with a tray full of snacks and 2 glasses of milk standing in his doorway. With flushed cheeks, the girl asked what was on her mind. "Would you like to share a snack with me?" After seeing the girl's cute expression, Berengar could not find it in good consciousness to decline her offer. Thus he parted from the doorway and led the girl to his desk, where he pulled out another chair and set it up next to his workstation. After placing down the tray of Lebkuchen and Pfeffernuss cookies which the castle's chefs had recently baked for the young lady, Adela spotted the exercise equipment in the corner of Berengar's room. Naturally, she inquired about their use. "What is that in the corner, back there?" Berengar did not even need to glance behind him to know what she was referring to. As such, he snacked on a Lebkuchen cookie and reminisced of his mother's baking from his previous life. After getting back to reality, he answered the young girl's question. "That's exercise equipment, it helps build strength." The girl had never seen such equipment before, but she immediately lost interest when she heard it was used exercise. As long as she kept her current figure and grew into it properly, she had no desire to do any more exercise than was necessary. Her gemstone-like eyes quickly took notice of the letters in which Berengar was in the process of drafting. "What are those for?" Berengar washed down the cookie he had just snagged with a sip of milk before getting back to work on his letters. "They're invitations for our engagement ceremony. I figured I might as well invite the local nobility to the occasion. After all, I feel they would be more inclined to talk to me with you by my side. Once they get to know the real me, the vicious rumors that have been spread about me will begin to disappear or at the very least replaced with less harmful ones." Adela looked at Berengar with hearts in her eyes. He was throwing a party to celebrate their engagement? That was completely unheard of and extremely romantic, at least in her eyes. Berengar was aware that traditional engagements from his previous life and the ceremonies that preceded them would not become a thing for many decades still. However, what he was unaware of was just how much of an effect this party would have in his fiancée's opinion of him. The girl got really excited when she heard he was throwing a party and inviting many nobles. She couldn't wait to see such a splendid occasion. So when will this party be taking place?" Berengar answered without delay as he continued to write the invitation letters. "About a month or so. I need time to sell some of the steel I have stockpiled to afford the expenses. It won't be a simple affair." As Berengar realized the expense this party would incur, he figured he might as well sell an extra ton or two to avoid causing his father unnecessary heartache. After all, the man loved to spend his money on luxuries but always felt bad about it afterward. As such, the couple spent the remainder of the afternoon together enjoying some snacks while discussing the details of the upcoming party. Pleasantly unaware of the storm heading in their direction, taking the form of a sadistic vixen. Chapter 17 Immoral Temptation. From the view of the carriage, those dwelling inside could see the castle of Kufstein in their sights. They had been traveling for nearly a week now and finally arrived at their destination. Inside the luxurious carriage were 2 individuals in their teenage years, Lambert and Lind, who had spent the entire journey in silence. Every time Lambert attempted to speak with Lind, he was given a deathly glare and a crack of the whip. Eventually, he decided to mind his own business. The only thing that made the trip bearable was knowing that his brother's life would soon come to an end, and he would be next in line for the title of Baron. A rider was sent ahead of the caravan to ensure that the von Kufsteins were aware that the Count of Tyrol's daughter was approaching them. This was to avoid any awkwardness that may arise from randomly showing up in another noble's territory. Even if she was traveling with the son of said noble, it would be a huge slap to the face of Baron Sigurd if she showed up unannounced. However, she did not ride ahead out of fear of giving Berengar time to defend himself against her schemes. If what Lambert said was true, the young man had been slightly more cunning than she was led to believe. She blamed the lack of intelligence entirely upon Lambert and his inability to gauge his own brother's cleverness. If her scheme was to work as planned, she would need to put on an act to entice Berengar into a room alone with her, where she would play with him a bit before ending his life. She wondered what his screams would sound like. Would he have the high-pitched tone of his kid brother? Or the deep grunts of a man? She was beginning to get aroused, thinking about the pain she would inflict upon her victim. As the carriage arrived in the castle's courtyard, the Baron and his family came to greet the Count of Tyrol's daughter. Even Adela had been present to show her respect to Linda's position, a position in which she was equal. Yet when Lind stepped out of the carriage and gazed upon the family, her cheerful facade nearly cracked when she saw that there was no character fitting Berengar's description lined up to greet her. Did this bastard seriously not give her any face? Where could he possibly be? This was outrageous. She was his liege's daughter. She thought about the suffering she would inflict on the feeble man for this slight and managed to keep her facade up as she greeted her hosts. Lady Lind von Habsburg thanks you for your hospitality. Personally, she felt sickened showing any form of respect to the barons who in her eyes were hardly a step above commoners. Yet, due to her noble obligations, she could not poorly represent her family in front of their vassals. Sigurd and his family bowed respectfully to their liege's daughter. Adela was the only individual to remain standing, and that was because she was of equal status to Lind and would not lower her head to appear. Sigurd declared in a voice loud enough for the entire courtyard to hear. You honor us with your presence. Welcome to our humble abode. We hope you find your stay to be adequate. Sigurd had said a similar thing to Adela, and Adela seemed to be thoroughly enjoying her stay. Still, like a shrewd man, the old baron could tell at a single glance that Lind was putting up an act to maintain face and inwardly looked down upon them for their castle, which was practically destitute compared to the lavish castle her family dwelled in. I'm sure it will be enough. The strawberry blonde-haired vixen said in an indifferent tone. She was too preoccupied with being upset over Berengar's absence to be concerned with the inelegant trappings she found herself surrounded with. She could no longer bear the insult and inquired about Berengar's whereabouts. Your son tells me he has an elder brother. Tell me, where is he right now? Is he not aware of my arrival? And there it was, the uptight, snobbish attitude in which Sigurd and Gisela pitied their second son for having to deal with. If they knew what was going on behind the scenes between the couple, they would never allow the marriage to occur. Unfortunately for everyone involved, they were unaware of Lambert's suffering. Sigurd had an awkward expression on his face. Berengar had set out early in the morning, saying something about installing pipes in a field. He truly did not know where his eldest son was at the moment. I'm afraid I don't exactly know his whereabouts. He said something about installing pipes in a field and left early in the morning. I apologize on his behalf for his abs. Before Sigurd could finish his sentence, a hand was raised in the air cutting him off. Lind was firmly holding her palm face up at him, informing him to be silent. No need for an apology. I expect to hear it straight from his mouth when I see him later tonight. I assume he will be home in time for the feast? Sigurd had a look of concern on his face. This girl was not easy to please. He had to be sure to lecture Berengar to apologize properly to her later that evening. They could not afford to offend their liege's family. All he could do was agree to her conditions before leading her into the castle and showing the young lady the lodgings she would be staying at during the duration of her visit. Meanwhile, in Gunther's field, Berengar and the townsfolk quickly installed the first set of irrigation pipes. He had received notice from Ludwig early in the morning that he had finished production on a set of irrigation pipes and had enough to fill up a single field. As such, the young lord had rushed out of his quarters and aided in installing them. He worked side by side with the peasants as they connected the wheel-line irrigation system across the field. After it had been entirely set up, Berengar was given the honors of activating the system. Within seconds, water sprinkled from the thin steel wheels, which were stationed every few feet across a long steel pipe that supplied water to the aforementioned wheels. Cheers echoed across the field as many villagers had gathered to witness Berengar's latest invention, and it did not disappoint. Gunther and his family practically wiped tears from their eyes as they saw the irrigation functioning properly. This meant he did not need to spend nearly as much energy watering his crops every day. This was truly a great day for his family and the village. After the cheering had settled, Berengar cleared his throat and spoke with an authoritative tone. "Citizens of Kufstein, I present to you the wheel line irrigation system. Our industrial sector is currently working on producing many of these devices, enough to fill all the fields of our humble domain. I hope this makes your lives easier in the coming days." A thunder of applause alongside cheering could be heard all the way to the castle, and it did not go unnoticed. However, now was not the time to celebrate. The true celebration would come when the harvest came into effect. With all of the recent innovations, it would be an unimaginable yield this year. After saying his farewells to the villagers, Berengar returned to the castle. He quickly engaged in his nightly bath after dressing in a particularly exquisite black velvet doublet in gold brocade and matching breeches. After all, now that he was engaged, he figured he should dress nicer, even if the attire were a bit too gaudy for his tastes. However, when he entered the dining room, all eyes were set upon him, something to which he had become accustomed to. However, the glances of Lambert and the stunning woman sitting next to him particularly caught his attention. He had not seen Lambert in over half a month. It was no surprise he was acting this way when Berengar's physical transformation had even stunned his family members who witnessed it in full. Though Berengar did not care in the slightest about his vile brother's opinion, what caught his glance was the heavenly beauty sitting next to Lambert. She had to be the most beautiful young woman he had seen in the entirety of his 2 lives. Was that Lambert's fiancée? He instantly felt envious of his younger brother and thought to himself, "Fuck, what kind of shit luck do I have to get stuck with the 12-year-old cousin when that scheming prick gets an angel like her?" Meanwhile, Lind had an even stronger reaction to Berengar's appearance. Her heart began to beat rapidly as she saw the suave appearance of the healthy young lord in front of her. He was nowhere near what Lambert had described to her. He was fashionable, he was handsome, and most of all, he was tall, unlike his kid brother. It took the sadistic vixen all of 3 seconds to change her scheme from seduction and assassination to seduction and enslavement. Why the hell should she bother with a little twit like Lambert when the heir of the von Kufstein family was the prize catch? If she could make Berengar her slave, she would be the happiest mistress in the world. Sure, Lambert was good-looking and had his boyish charms, but he could not compare to Berengar. She was furious that she had been tricked into an engagement to the second son. She began to wonder why she was constantly given misinformation these days. Who was the idiot who said that Berengar was a sickly, indolent wastrel? She would have that fool's tongue cut out for speaking such slander. The lustful glances exchanged by Berengar and Lind did not go unnoticed by those who were sitting at the dinner table. Lambert's face was beginning to turn red with fury, while Adela was pouting in silence as she thought to herself, "Just because she has a large chest, that idiot is practically drooling over her. I won't forgive him for this." Finally, Sigurd had enough of the display and grunted in displeasure, which woke the 2 strangers out of their trance. "Berengar, are you not going to sit down?" Berengar immediately recovered his calm and sat down and said grace with the family. He almost lost himself there for a second. He needed to remember that this girl was the fiancée of his little brother. Obviously, she was out to get him. If he fell for her charms, he was truly a dead man, something he did not want to repeat so soon after his previous experience with death. While he was calming himself down, the stunning young woman introduced herself. "Linda von Habsburg, daughter of Count Lothar von Habsburg, it is a pleasure to meet your acquaintance." Deep down, the girl could barely keep a straight face without fawning over Berengar. She had acted too cordially. She was never this pleasant with other people, especially of a lower house like this. She, too, had to get a grip, or else she would fall prey to her own scheme. Berengar had no choice but to introduce himself. He tried to behave himself as he could feel the deathly glare that Adela was giving him from his left side. In the end, he still sounded too flirtatious as he gave Lind his greeting. "Berengar von Kufstein, son of Sigurd von Kufstein, and heir to the Barony of Kufstein, rest assured the pleasure is all mine." Lind had no idea why, but she coquettishly laughed at his remark, thus resulting in Henrietta gagging at the display of immoral affection. She would not let this vixen steal both her big brothers. Something had to be done about this situation. Eventually, the awkward atmosphere faded as the food arrived. Lind had a similar reaction as Adela when she first tasted the fine cuisine presented by the chefs. However, hers was far more exaggerated in an attempt to seduce Berengar. Every time she moaned in ecstasy at the taste, Berengar could feel a battle of wills in his mind. As if the angel and devil on his shoulders were advising him on two different paths. Damn this girl. She was too much of a succubus for a virgin like him to handle. Seeing as the situation was spiraling, Berengar elected to leave the table before he lost himself to temptation. He excused himself early and headed for the bath. While he was fleeing the scene, Lind smiled wickedly. She had decided she would make this man her slave at any cost. Not a toy like all the previous suitors, but a dedicated slave, someone who would serve her for the rest of her life. As she watched Berengar's fine behind walk away from her, she devised a devious plan to ensnare him. After everyone in the castle had fallen asleep, she would approach Berengar's room with a flagon of wine and 2 chalices while dressed in her most revealing nightgown. She would persuade him to allow her entry to his bedchambers under the guise of inquiring about his absence earlier in the day. Afterward, she would pour him a drink which would obviously be drugged, not with deadly poison but a powerful aphrodisiac. When Berengar could no longer contain his lust and pounced at her, she would subdue him and force him to recognize her as his eternal mistress, his owner, his countess. Then when he had fully submitted, she would help him relieve himself. After a week, maybe even a month of proper training, she would give her chastity to him and swindle him into breaking their betrothals and getting together by faking a pregnancy. It was the perfect plan, and it was all supposed to go swimmingly. So when it was finally over, all she could ask herself was, how did things end up like this? Chapter 18 Reversal of Fortune. After Berengar had fled the dining scene, he quickly took a cold bath to calm himself down. He could not fall prey to this temptress's schemes, it would surely mean the death of him. After spending enough time in the bath to cool his bodily reaction, he returned to his room, where he began to draft plans for the steel plow. It was the next step in his irrigation initiative. He would work well into the night as per usual. Only after midnight had approached was he disturbed from his work by the knocking sound at his door. He was wary. There was only one person who would possibly disturb him at this hour. Lind was here to plot against him. He would not fall for her advances like he had done earlier that evening, or so he thought. After calming his heart, he approached the door and opened it, where he saw Linda's divine figure in an especially revealing nightgown that should not exist in this time period. Clearly, this was hand-tailored with the purpose of seduction in mind. The gown was baby blue, with white embroidery, and was designed to enhance her natural curves. The femme fatale standing before him wore a seducing smile on her face with a tray that contained 2 chalices of wine. He could already guess her plot. Linda's expression turned sultry as she expressed her desire to enter his bedchambers. "Can I come in? I have something to talk to you about." Berengar smiled and played along to her games. He had already figured out what she was planning and intended to turn it around on her. As such, he opened the door and allowed the young temptress into his room. "I don't see why not." After Lind crossed into the room, she placed the drinks down upon his nightstand and lay down upon his bed, making sure to spread herself out in a way that showed off her perfectly proportioned body in the best way possible. To a virgin like Berengar, a beautiful young seductress like Lind was the most potent weapon. Berengar almost fell for her charms, but he quickly reminded himself that she was sent to eliminate him, and as such, he forced himself out of his trance. Afterward, he sat down next to her on the bed, where he made sure to sit in a manner that revealed his blueprints upon his desk. Though Lind stared at Berengar's charming appearance with a rising degree of lust, her eyes were quickly drawn to the blueprints, and as such, she swiftly got off the bed and walked over to his desk while inquiring about them. "What are these?" While Lind had taken the bait, Berengar switched the drink position so that this would-be assassin would have a taste of her own medicine. Afterward, he grabbed the non-poisoned drink and took a sip, explaining the nature of his designs in brief detail. Just some simple agricultural equipment I have designed. It is really nothing important." Hearing that it was designed for agriculture, the snobbish noblewoman immediately lost interest and returned to her seat. Noticing that Berengar had already taken a drink, a sinister smile spread across her immaculate lips as she sat down and took a sip from her own chalice. completely unaware that Berengar had switched the drinks. After she took the first sip, Berengar began to extend the conversation so that she would keep consuming the poisoned wine. As such, he immediately asked about why she had stopped by his quarters. "So why are you here, alone, so late at night? Do you not know it is inappropriate?" Lind continued to drink from her wine until the whole cup was empty before answering Berengar's question. However, as she was about to answer his question, she became incredibly dizzy. She could feel her body heat rising, and she struggled to stay sitting on the bed. Despite all of these changes, she tried to control herself and answer his questions. The heavenly beauty quickly began to feel her body becoming sensitive, to the point where the breeze from the windows blowing upon her skin raised her arousal. Something was terribly wrong. In her fugue-like state, she slowly realized that she had somehow consumed the drugged wine that she had prepared for Berengar. Realizing what Berengar had done, Lind grew furious and tried to get up so that she could reprimand him. However, all that she managed to do was fall into Berengar's arms, where he looked at her with confusion. Linda's sensitivity was greatly enhanced by the drugged wine, and by simply being touched, she felt her arousal increase. Her flawless porcelain skin had a great deal of flushing across it while glistening with sweat. Lind was breathing heavily while looking into Berengar's sapphire eyes with a longing expression. Berengar gulped heavily as he came to a sudden realization. This girl had not attempted to poison him. At least not in a lethal sense. Instead, she spiked his drink with a powerful aphrodisiac. Just what exactly did this little vixen have in mind for tonight? Realizing that this was finally his opportunity to lose his virginity, Berengar quickly began to disrobe. After taking off his shirt, the lust in Linda's body grew to an uncontrollable extent as she gazed upon his well-toned figure. After removing both of their clothes, Berengar was ready to do the deed. However, he thought of a brilliant plan and managed to control his urges for a few moments before he went in for the kill. As such, a devilish smile appeared across his face as he gazed upon Linda's heavenly figure. Noticing that Berengar was not going through with the act, Lind felt greatly offended and she began to berate him. "What are you waiting for? Put it in." Berengar, on the other hand, shook his head as he grabbed a hold of one of her exquisite breasts. The moment he did, the girl climaxed from the mere touch. The act of which shocked Berengar. He could not believe how powerful the drug she consumed was. Nevertheless, it was not enough to relieve the girl of her condition, and as such Berengar began his interrogation. "What is Lambert planning by having you do this?" Though Lind was drugged and in a state of maximum arousal, she still had a strong will and attempted to resist divulging the information. However, after a little more teasing, she began to sing like a songbird. "He wanted me to seduce you and kill you." This answer shocked Berengar. Clearly, this was not a lethal substance. Just how exactly did he end up in this scenario? As such, he inquired further about this information. "So how exactly did you end up like a bitch in heat?" Lind pursed her lips and began to pout. However, as Berengar further toyed with her body, she quickly divulged her shameful plan. "The moment I saw you, I knew you were the one." Berengar's jaw fell open. Did this girl seriously confess to him? Was this how a confession was supposed to happen? What was he, some hentai protagonist? Nevertheless, he continued to dig for an answer. "What do you mean by the one?" By now, Lind was in so much misery from not releasing her pent-up arousal that she no longer had any resistance to Berengar's questions. "My slave. I have toys, but I have never found a proper slave. I wanted to drug you and force you to submit to me." Berengar's head was quickly filled with a variety of images while he contemplated her words. It took him a moment before he realized what kind of girl she was. Oh shit, she is a hardcore dominatrix. Wait a second, this is an opportunity. A wicked grin spread across Berengar's face as an evil plot filled his head. If he went through with it, there were only two outcomes. One of them most certainly would be his demise, but to have such a divine young woman to himself was well worth the risk. Lind could no longer contain herself and began to whimper as she began to plead with Berengar. "I cannot wait any longer, put it in now." Berengar shook his head and teased her some more before giving his command. "Beg." The shoe was on the other foot now, and he fully intended to take advantage of the situation. Hearing the words she had said countless times before to other men, Lind began to frown, but she was in no condition to negotiate. As such, she quickly began to beg. Please put it in. Berengar shook his head once more and wagged his finger before giving her further instructions. Call me master, and you will get what you want. Lind had grown furious. She would never submit to a man. However, the longer she waited, the more unbearable her situation became, especially as Berengar continued to play with her body. Eventually, she submitted to Berengar and voiced the words he wanted to hear. Please put it in me, master. Berengar smiled and nodded as he expressed his agreement with her words. That's better. Before Lind could chastise him, Berengar jumped into the fray and claimed his prize. The two would go at it the entire night before Lind was finally relieved from the effects of the drug. After the light of dawn shone upon their naked figures, Berengar noticed a peculiar sight. His white bedsheets were stained with blood, which meant only one thing. However, before he could react, Lind had dug her teeth into his shoulder. It was not a vicious bite intent to harm. Instead, it was more of an affectionate nibble. Nevertheless, Berengar flicked her on the nose and chastised her. Bad girl. Lind quickly flushed in embarrassment. She was completely ashamed of herself for her actions from the night before, and she quickly put on her nightgown and rushed out of Berengar's room, where she headed for her own quarters. Berengar, on the other hand, was smiling with satisfaction in his own room, where he began to speak to himself aloud. Berengar, you finally did it. Hopefully, things won't be too awkward at the breakfast table. Chapter 19. Your wish is my command. When Lind fled Berengar's bedchambers, she covered her flushed appearance with her hands. She was so embarrassed she wished she could die. Berengar was far from gentle the night before. He had taken a stern and dominant position, not allowing her control over the situation for a single moment. It greatly wounded her pride as a dominatrix to be pinned down and bred like a bitch in heat. The fact that she had given her virginity to Berengar because she was careless was another point of contention in her mind. Though she had entertained herself by humiliating men through physical displays of dominance in the past, she had never engaged in any sexual activities before. For all her bluster, she was completely inexperienced until now. There was only one way she could forget this humiliation, by taking it out on her current toy. She resolved herself to be especially brutal to Lambert later today. She had no desire to inform anyone, especially her father, about her misfortune. If she did, her reputation as a domineering young lady would be completely ruined. After all, she had her chastity taken by a lowly baron's son, and she could not possibly lose face like that. Instead, she opted to find a way to get vengeance on Berengar herself. Somehow she would find a way to get even. Or so she told herself. The conflicted state of her subconscious thoughts told a different story. Several hours had passed, and Berengar treated the morning like any other. He had to pretend as if nothing happened. The probability of Lind informing anyone of the deed the two had done the night before was slim. As such, the likelihood of her father finding out about it and demanding he takes responsibility was practically non-existent. He understood Linda's type. She would not easily inform others of how she had gotten herself drugged and begged a man of Berengar's position to mate with her. Despite the slim probability, Berengar decided to take several precautions and advance some of the plans he had already been thinking about for some time. As such, after exercising and bathing, Berengar drafted blueprints for flintlock muskets and 12-pound cannons. He did not have the time or resources to produce rifled muskets at the moment or percussion locks. Such things required advanced machinery and a chemical stockpile of mercury fulminate, which he was far from achieving at the early stages of his development. He did not even have a single court alchemist in which he could teach the science of chemistry. As such, there was no one to make such a valuable chemical, and he did not have the time to spend wasting his day away on elementary chemistry. Once his blueprints were finished, he rushed the designs over to Ludwig and informed him to create a batch of 100 flintlock muskets and 3 12-pound cannons as quickly as possible. Ludwig was concerned with the anxious expression on Berengar's face and had to ask. These designs are centuries ahead of anything I have seen regarding gunpowder. I have to ask, what could we possibly need these for? Berengar was a gentleman, or so he liked to think. As such, he would never tell anyone what he and Lind had done the night before. Thus he came up with some excuse to convince Ludwig to start the production of weaponry. I plan to start a militia. If anything, Kufstein's defenses are quite lax, and I think it would be wise to invest in such a force. Just keep it on a need-to-know basis. I don't want details about these weapons being leaked. To Ludwig, this was a logical request. However, the only problem with it was timing. They were currently in the middle of developing irrigation piping, and as such, it would not be easy to switch over to the production of arms. However, he could tell Berengar was adamant about this, and as such, he acquiesced to the young lord's request. I'll divert some resources from the irrigation assembly line to the production of these weapons you have designed. The workers won't know what they're making, so rest assured. Quote, that's right, due to the many pieces of the irrigation system, Berengar had implemented a rudimentary assembly line system to expedite productivity. Thus, as long as nobody was aware of the finished product, except for those who could be trusted with the confidential information, then they could feasibly assemble the weapons in secret and arm a peasant militia with them. Training in basic line tactics and operation of simple yet effective weapons could be achieved much quicker than training a swordsman for war. Berengar clasped Ludwig on the shoulder and thanked him for his service. I thank you, my friend, from the bottom of my heart. When the profits come in from the steel ingots, I will be sure to give you a raise. Ludwig humbly shook his head as he conversed with the young lord. No thanks is required. I'm just doing what I must for the realm. Berengar released his grip on Ludwig's shoulder and wiped the sweat from his brow. All right, I'm needed at the castle. Inform me when the weapons are fully manufactured. Ludwig bowed at Berengar as he departed. Of course, my lord. With that, Berengar re-entered the castle grounds and found his way to the dining room, where the family was sitting calmly as if they were completely unaware of Berengar's scandalous activities he had committed the night before. Even Lind seemed to have partially recovered from the debacle and was seated peacefully next to Lambert. It was only when she spotted Berengar did she glare menacingly at him. Sure enough, the young temptress would not bend to his will easily, but that was fine. Berengar would enjoy the process. After sitting down at the table and eating breakfast with his family and fiancée, he felt the anxiety in the pit of his stomach slowly fade away. However, Linda's cold sky-blue eyes never allowed Berengar out of her sight. As if she was watching him, wary that he might try something then and there. However, when she saw Berengar's tranquil expression as he ignored her completely and conversed with his little fiancée as if nothing had happened during the night, she was inwardly outraged. This bastard won't even give me the slightest attention after what happened last night. Was it completely meaningless to him? How could he treat me this way? I swear on my ancestors' graves you will bend to my will before the week is done. Unknowingly she had bit her lips and crossed her legs as she examined Berengar's loving expression towards Adela with fire and fury in her heart. However, there was something else mixed in with her scorn. Was that jealousy she felt? How could she possibly be jealous of that little girl? Clearly, her mind was playing tricks on her. After drinking from her chalice, she nearly choked on it when she realized it was wine, the same flavor of wine that had caused her to lose herself to lust the night before. Despite it being ordinary wine, she began to feel flustered and dizzy, which did not go unnoticed by the others. Gisela, with ever the watchful eye, inquired with a concerned tone. Are you okay, my lady? With flushed cheeks, Lind responded to the curious gazes of the others in the most dignified manner she could. I'm afraid I've had too much wine with my breakfast. Lambert, can you be a doll and take me to my quarters? Lambert tensed up when he heard those words. He was completely unaware that Lind had changed her plot attempting to drug and enslave Berengar last night. He figured she would at least wait a few weeks before she tried to scheme against the man. After being chastised for his failure, he was certain she would be wise about her attempt to assassinate his brother. Clearly, she just wanted to torture her toy some more at the moment. However, he could not decline as the punishment would only be more severe. Thus he left the table with Lind and dragged the heavenly beauty to her quarters. It wasn't until she left the dining room where her wary gaze finally dropped its focus on Berengar. After entering her room, Lind took out her conflicted emotions on Lambert, who acted as a target for her frustrations. However, what confused Lind most was that she no longer found pleasure in abusing the young boy. Instead, every time she heard the crack of the whip, she could not help but remember the rough treatment she endured the night before, and before long, she found herself aroused by her memories and desiring more. Soon enough, she began to feel a crisis in her identity. A proud dominatrix like herself should not be feeling this way over such memories. Before long, she threw the whip across the room in a fit of rage and screamed at Lambert, venting her own conflicted emotions on the poor boy as she did so. Instinctively she shouted a set of words designed to hurt him. Get the hell out. I don't want to see your ugly face for a long time." Lambert was perplexed. The girl had never acted this way before, but after taking her lash multiple times, he bit his tongue and quickly fled the scene while thinking to himself, "Crazy bitch, you are lucky that you are pretty." After Lambert had slammed the door on his way out, Lind latched the lock behind him and crawled up onto her bed as she hugged her knees while staring out the window in deep thought. What is happening to me? Why am I suddenly like this? Memories of the passionate night she had spent with Berengar filled her head, and the ecstasy she had felt when he had his way with her. She could not help but become incredibly aroused at the thought of being treated in such a way by a strong and domineering man like Berengar. Lost in her thoughts, Lind suddenly shook her head to get rid of all the unnecessary notions plaguing her mind. She would return tonight, however, this time she would be the one to make him beg. Or so she told herself. Her body was far more honest than her mind. At midnight Berengar suddenly heard a knock at his door again. He smiled as he realized his sinister plans might actually become a reality. As such, he put on a stoic facade and opened the door with an indifferent expression. "You again? Don't tell me you are here for more?" Lind had prepared an authoritative statement. She had even come with a plan so that she could whip Berengar into submission and return to her usual self. However, the moment she stared at him in his doorway with a look as if he did not care the slightest about her, something in her mind broke. She could no longer deny the affection she had for the man. Maybe he really was the one, but not her slave. Maybe he was her master? She shook her head in indignation and resolved herself to stay strong. While thinking such complex thoughts, Berengar noticed the whip in her hands and gazed at her coldly before inquiring about her intentions. "And just what do you plan to do with that?" Hearing Berengar's words immediately broke Lind from her trance. She began to breathe heavily as she knelt before Berengar and presented him her whip, which she had previously used to humiliate half a dozen young noblemen. The moment she did so she cursed herself inwardly. Exactly how is this staying strong? Seeing this action, Berengar was shocked. She broke quicker than he thought she would. He waited for a moment for Lind to explain herself, and finally, she said the words he wanted to hear. "Please punish me, master." Lind immediately screamed in agony within the confines of her mind over her mistake, but she could not express it in reality. Instead, she slowly followed Berengar and obeyed his commands, like an obedient slave. A wicked grin appeared on Berengar's face. As such, he led the girl into his room and closed his door, where the resulting sound of the whip's crack failed to penetrate the thick stone walls of his quarters. With this action, Lind had confirmed it for herself. A switch was flipped in her brain. She was no longer a sadistic dominatrix but a masochistic slave girl, and she could not be happier. After playing with the whip for a bit, Berengar pulled out a set of ropes he had lying around and bound Lind up. The rest of the night, he would enjoy himself to the fullest with her magnificent body. By the time the sun rose, Lind had absconded from his room like a frightened rabbit once more. Though she had begun the process of submission, there was still a great deal of pride in her heart, and it would take a while for her to surrender herself to Berengar fully. Over the course of the next week, Berengar would spend the time of the day overseeing the production of firearms and cannons, as well as the irrigation system and their slow implementation. He had gotten his father's approval to draft a volunteer militia, which began their training immediately. Even though the production of firearms was yet to be completed, the militia recruits could still drill and practice line tactics and undergo mental conditioning to become a cohesive unit, which was important on the field of battle. He modeled his militia's training after basic training from the U.S. Army, which he had experienced in his previous life. He was given full authority of the militia by his father, who saw it as a perfect way for his son to prepare for war and did not think anything else of it in the slightest. As such, the peasants flocked to the ranks of his militia to train in their spare time. After all, who would not want to defend their homes under the leadership of Berengar? When he was done with his work for the day, he would spend several hours with Adela inside the castle walls. Lind, of course, would purposely provoke Berengar in minor ways during his daytime with Adela. Then she would return to his chambers at night to be disciplined for her actions. She was slowly but surely becoming honest with herself. By the end of the week, her heart and soul had finally submitted to her desires, and by extension, Berengar. As the dawn rose on the first day of the new week, Lind did not flee out of the grasp of Berengar but cuddled closely in his arms, a warm smile on her face as she prodded his chest with her finger. "So what now, master?" Berengar looked at her in shock. Did she seriously call him master of her own free will? Normally she would only call him that when she was aroused, and she was clearly in a very calm state at the moment. As such, he decided to clarify the matter. "Master?" He could not help but question the girl. She had a look of confusion on her face as she stared him in the eyes. "Yes, that's what you wanted me to call you when we're alone. If not, I can call you by whatever it is you desire." Berengar could not help but chuckle. He had finally done it. He had taken an enormous gamble, and if he lost, it could easily have cost him his life. Yet, it turned into the greatest gain in the entirety of his 2 lives. He honestly expected her to hold on to her stubbornness a bit longer, but she was finally a properly broken-in slave. He had no idea what to say to this. In his past life, and his current one, he was a virgin until a week ago. The way he finally lost his V-card was not exactly something you would see in a fairy tale. Still, he lost it to the prettiest girl he had ever seen. A week later, she was calling him master? How the hell did he accomplish this? Apparently, Lind was not the only one who changed significantly during this past week. Berengar had grown more confident, more ambitious, and more reckless. After an entire week of rough and kinky intercourse, the girl was truly and utterly loyal to Berengar and Berengar alone. After thinking about the girl's question for some time in silence, he finally responded. "Master is the correct term. As for what comes next, I won't lie to you. It will be very dangerous for you, but if you complete it with satisfactory results, I will reward you with whatever you desire." Light sparkled in Linda's eyes when she heard the last part of Berengar's sentence as she grabbed a hold of his hand. "Anything for you, master." Berengar chuckled, and pulled her in close, and whispered in her ear. "I want you to spy on your father and my brother for me." He expected her to show some resistance. After all, her training had only gone on for a week, but instead, there was no hesitation in her voice while she returned the whisper as she breathed into his ear. "Your wish is my command." With that said, Berengar had gained the most valuable ally in his war of intrigue against his brother Lambert and the Count of Tyrol. They would not become aware that every plot they came up with to conspire against Berengar was secretly leaked to him by the most trusted member of their inner circle until it was too late. Though he would not know it now, one day, Lind would become the director of Berengar's extensive spy network and his personal concubine. A relationship in which a dynasty would be built upon. Chapter 20: Raising an Army. The sun rose in the clear blue sky above and shone through the open window of the Berengar's bed chamber, illuminating the scene of Berengar cuddling intimately with Lind. It would not be for many more hours before the rest of the castle awoke and began clambering about. As such, Berengar spent the time playing with his new slave and asking her many of his queries. Some he already knew the answer to and was merely testing her loyalty. When she honestly answered all of his questions, he was satisfied with the results of her training. Now that he had begun to trust her loyalty, Berengar had a peculiar interest in a rumor he heard recently. As the daughter of the Count of Tyrol, which was a region dominated by the Habsburg family and bordered the territory of the Duchy of Bavaria, Lind was in a much better position to gather intelligence than Berengar was. He was curious if she was aware of the inner workings of the royal court of Germany. Though the title King of Germany and its sovereign territory still existed at this point, it was far from what you would call a unified kingdom. Currently, the Duke of Luxembourg held the title King of Germany, though, over the centuries, the title had passed through many families' hands. Berengar had heard rumors about the kingdom facing a succession crisis. When the current king died, there was a high possibility of internal conflict. Yet, he had no details about what was happening at the highest court of his country. However, Lind might know the details. Thus Berengar decided to see what she knew about it. Is it true the kingdom is on the brink of civil war? Linda looked up at him with a concerned expression and thought to herself. Is the Baron and his family not aware of the current calamity that looms over the kingdom? Having fully accepted Berengar as her master, she would not hide anything from the young lord. Whatever he wanted to know, as long as she knew an answer, she would unhesitatingly give it to him. Of course. Why do you think my father is so interested in Kufstein's iron reserves? He wants to build an army second to none for the upcoming war. Berengar narrowed his eyes at the attractive girl currently pressing her bare chest into his own as she clung to him. What exactly does he need such a powerful army for? A gorgeous smile appeared across the peerless beauty's face as she swiped the bangs of her strawberry blonde hair out of her eyes. She stared at Berengar with her sky-blue pupils, expecting a reward for her answer. He wants to become the Duke of Austria. When the main family presses its claim to the throne, he will turn on them and seize Vienna as his own. Berengar patted the girl's head softly as if she were a pet and complimented her. Good girl, what else can you tell me about the current succession crisis? Lind could not stop smiling as Berengar stroked her red gold hair with his firm but loving hand. She had no idea that being complimented by a master was so satisfying. She began to question why she had wasted her time as a dominatrix when being the slave felt so much more rewarding. Currently, the King of Germany is a feeble old man with no rightful heirs. He fathered no sons and only one daughter in his lifetime. The current claimants to the throne are his nephew, the legitimized bastard son of the king's younger brother, who recently passed. The problem is, even if he is a legitimized bastard, he's still a bastard, and few people support his claim to the throne. Berengar nodded at the information. This was valuable intel. He decided to reward the girl by playing with her well-endowed chest. Which startled Lind at first, but her face quickly became flushed as she closed her eyes, enjoying the treatment. However, after Berengar stopped, she realized he was waiting for her to finish her analysis. The second claimant to the throne is the Duke of Bavaria. His claim essentially relies on the fact that before the House von Luxemburg took over, his house the von Wittelsbachs were the monarchs. The divine seductress stopped her sentence after explaining the second claimant to the throne of Germany. She clearly wanted to be rewarded for each piece of information. Feeling the intel she provided was worth it, and in good faith, Berengar decided to indulge her as he pressed his lips against her own and twirled their tongues together for a few seconds before releasing. If she wanted to go any further, she would have to finish providing her report. Taking the hint, Lind quickly revealed the last bit of information she knew about the ongoing fight for the throne. Lastly, there's the Duke of Austria. He married the current king's only daughter and wants to install his teenage son as King of Germany. As you know, my family is merely a cadet branch of the von Habsburgs who rule Austria. Thus my father plans to betray them when they march on Munich and seize the duchy for himself. Lind immediately blushed upon revealing the last of her knowledge regarding the current political situation the kingdom was facing. Clearly expecting Berengar to finish what he started with her. However, the next statement that came from Berengar's mouth immediately triggered the discipline he had brutally installed in the young woman over the past week. A wicked smile appeared across Berengar's face as he saw the girl eyeing him up, waiting for him to conquer her. He wanted to see how far she had been conditioned at this point. As such, he gave a command in the most authoritative voice he could muster. Beg. The face of the youthful enchantress immediately became beet red as she followed his command and got on her knees, spreading her lower lips for Berengar to see in all of its splendor. Please, reward me, master. Berengar could contain his lust no longer and spent the remainder of the morning enjoying his new toy to the fullest extent. One could say that the activities they engaged in for the next hour and a half could be considered his morning exercise for the day. It was not until their bodies were filled with sweat that Berengar finally emerged from his room. Lind was instructed to wait until the coast was clear before she rushed back to her room down the hall from his. Once Berengar verified the absence of others, Lind subtly snuck back to her quarters as if the two of them spending the night together had never occurred. Shortly thereafter, Lind had closed the door behind her, and Berengar's expression sank to one of deep concern as he thought to himself. It looks like I'm going to have to further my recruitment efforts. His next choice of action was to enter the bath and wash off the sweat that had accumulated across his body throughout the night and early morning. Having completed his bath and gotten dressed, he exited the private bathhouse his family had built and entered the dining room, where the rest of his family was waiting for him. Including Lind and Adela, who were sitting opposite each other across the table. Adela was not pleased with the buxom beauty in front of her. Over the past week, this strawberry blonde-haired bimbo had interrupted all of her dates with Berengar and purposely attempted to provoke him. What could be the reason for Lind to have a conflict with Berengar? Unless, of course, she was acting on Lambert's behalf. Were the two brothers really so estranged that Lambert had to send his fiancée to instigate strife? Adela had begun to realize something the rest of Berengar's family was blissfully unaware of with only basic conjecture. There was a war of intrigue going on between the two siblings over the inheritance. The more she thought of it as a possibility, the more it began to make sense to her. She decided that she would have to ask Berengar about it later when she had the chance. When Berengar sat down at the table next to Adela, he could feel the intense gaze of envy coming from Lind and began to question whether this slave of his had any sense of self-restraint. He instantly gave the unrivaled bombshell a glare signaling for her to act normal. If the rest of his family caught on to their current relationship, it would not end well for the two of them. Once more, Berengar entertained breakfast with his family. Nothing of importance happened. Lambert completely believed that his fiancée still intended on assassinating his older brother and was trying to seduce him. He did not have the slightest clue that the girl of his dreams had been completely stolen from him right under his nose by his elder brother. After having a pleasant meal free of discord, Berengar departed from the castle and entered the field where his militia was being trained to use firearms and cannons. Their numbers had grown to approximately 250 over the past week, and despite there not being enough muskets and 12-pounders to go around, there had been a great deal of progress in their training. Berengar seriously needed to sell the steel stockpile as soon as possible to get the mines running at full capacity. It would be essential to surviving the upcoming war. A few veteran men-at-arms belonging to Sieghard's standing army snickered at the pathetic peasants training with their hand cannons. They foolishly mistook the sophisticated musket capable of penetrating a knight's full plate with ease as the primitive firearm currently in use in a few feudal armies. If they had known that the invention of the musket ushered in the end of the era of knights and men-at-arms like themselves, they would be filled with despair. Each musket was issued its own socket bayonet, a technology that eliminated the need for pikemen and swordsmen. The pike and shot era never had a chance to come to fruition the moment Julian was reincarnated as Berengar. It was not until the 12-pound cannon made a display that the veteran soldiers began to feel a sense of worry at the arms in use by the peasants. The 12-pound cannon Berengar had designed was based on the 19th-century smoothbore cannon Vizier de 12, or more commonly known in English-speaking circles as the 1857 12-pounder Napoleon, named after Napoleon III, who commissioned it in the 19th century. This cannon was light enough to be towed by horses and used as a field gun, but fired a heavy enough round to be used effectively in sieges during the era it was designed for. It was capable of firing shell, shot, or solid ball. Judging by the lack of chemical industry, it currently only utilized ball and canister shots. The primary differences between this piece of artillery and the one used extensively during the American Civil War were that it was made out of pure steel, thus making it more robust than its bronze counterpart, and that it did not utilize the more advanced friction primer to activate the firing sequence. As was pointed out earlier, Berengar had no chemical manufacturing process right now, and thus the complex chemical sequence needed to manufacture friction primers was unavailable. Instead, the cannon utilized the older vent primer and linstock to fire the cannon. It was a slower and less reliable process, but it was still used for centuries before the friction primer was invented, and it was the best option Berengar currently had. When the cannons simultaneously roared and fired off rounds of canister shot at the straw targets, which were placed at roughly 400 yards away from the guns, the men-at-arms who were previously mocking the peasant militia nearly lost their minds. Hundreds of straw dummies were shredded apart by the canister shot provided by the three cannons. As veterans of multiple wars, they had never witnessed such a destructive weapon before and could hardly believe their eyes. Berengar watched his militia form ranks and fired the muskets in their possession effectively. He could not wait until his militia could qualify as a true army. Despite being unarmored, the 250-man militia would soon be capable of providing a line of defense for the secluded mountain barony against its potential enemies. Berengar wanted to armor them in munitions-grade half-plate but could not get the approval. His father would never waste the production of armor on what he deemed to be mere peasant levies. If the peasant militia found themselves facing muskets, the armor would be practically useless. However, against armies equipped with bows, crossbows, and hand cannons, the armor Berengar had in mind was more than capable of defending against such threats. Munitions-grade plate was an invention that would normally be invented in the next century. Unlike current plate armor designs, it was not hand-fitted to the individual. Instead, it was mass-produced with the intent of equipping common soldiers. Berengar would never supply his father's forces with the technology he created. They did not answer to him, and he felt as if his father would carelessly hand over the weapons for reverse engineering to his lieges. As such, he had to play down how effective the weapons really were when in discussions with his father. After aiding in the training of his militia, he returned to the castle where he saw Adela waiting for him outside his bedchamber with a letter in her hand. Naturally, his interest was sparked, and as such, he opened his door and allowed the young girl inside. You have something you want to tell me? Adela nodded with a pure smile on her face as she handed the letter to Berengar. It was from her father and concerned about purchasing the steel ingots lying in his storehouse. Berengar was extremely delighted when he saw the price offered and had no reason to negotiate. It was well above what he considered a fair price. Evidently, the Count of Steiermark was also preparing for war. Berengar was so excited by the news that he picked the young belle up in the air and kissed her on the cheek, which instantly caused her to blush. However, before she could protest, Berengar placed her down and patted her head. You just made me a delighted young man. I haven't even found a potential buyer yet, and you have already done the work for me. Lind may have the appearance of a goddess and was the perfect slave, but she was far from wife material. On the other hand, Adela played that role perfectly, and Berengar was confident that she, too, would be as gorgeous as Lind one day. Berengar was completely satisfied with his romantic side of life. All he needed was 2 girls by his side, any more, and it would become a hassle. He had no desire to become another shitty harem protagonist. Berengar spent the rest of the evening walking around the courtyard with Adela. Lately, he had been too preoccupied with training Lind, and he could not afford to neglect the relationship with his future wife. After a long evening of walking and enjoying the sunset, the two finally parted ways when the sun went down. She was still too young to be involved in Berengar's nightlife. Luckily he had a properly aged beauty who would do whatever he asked waiting for him in his bedchamber when he returned. The master and slave spent another night enjoying each other's warmth, and the rest of the family was none the wiser. Chapter 21 Forming a Battalion. It had been over a week since Lind first arrived, and as far as Lambert knew she still had not made an attempt at Berengar's life. In fact, aside from the first night where she flirted with Berengar at dinner, she had made no effort to seduce him afterward. Worse yet, she had actively impeded her attempts to do so by deliberately provoking Berengar when the young lord spent time with his fiancée. Lambert could not begin to comprehend the thought process of that crazy bitch he called his mistress. Lambert was not a slow kid by any means. He was beginning to piece together that something was not right. After all, Lind had not abused him since the second day of her visit. During that time, she was extremely unstable and forced him out of her room while insulting his appearance. Though he did not enjoy the treatment he received from Lind, the fact that she no longer engaged in such brutality meant one thing: she had completely lost interest in her toy. But why? Why would the girl who sadistically took pleasure in his pain until just a week ago change her attitude completely overnight? Unless something happened the night of her arrival? The more he thought about his beautiful fiancée's odd behavior, the more he realized that something was going on with her. He just could not quite find out what. He would have no choice but to politely interrogate her when the two were alone. There was still a deep internal fear of the young maiden who had caused many scars upon Lambert's body and heart. Currently, Lambert was sitting across from his older brother at the dining table, who chatted with his 12-year-old fiancée about the delicacies sitting on the table before them. The family was dining upon German pancakes. Lambert had no idea where these culinary inventions were coming from. Nevertheless, he thoroughly enjoyed the food that had recently appeared on their tables. Suddenly Lambert could hear his father's stern voice question Berengar, the contents of which shocked Lambert. So Berengar, my son, I hear you have equipped your militia with hand cannons? Do you believe this to believe a wise choice? Berengar nodded his head at his father's words as he snacked on a piece of breakfast sausage. Of course, father, learning archery or the sword takes an extended period of time to gain the proficiency necessary to be useful on the battlefield. Hand cannons are simple weapons that the peasant forces can effectively use as a line of defense. Their effective range is quite poor, so they're better suited to defensive positions. Berengar had intentionally not corrected his father about the true nature or efficiency of the muskets. If he had done so, his weapons undoubtedly would be confiscated, and the technology leaked to his enemies as such. Berengar emphasized their defensive ability, but not offense. Sieghard still had many questions about the weapons used by Berengar's militia. They were not ordinary hand cannons and artillery, but he trusted his son's word. As such, when he heard they were defensive in use, he lost interest in the muskets. They were best suited to a local militia after all. However, the cannons, on the other hand, he had heard remarkable things about and needed to know if they could be used efficiently in the field. What about those cannons they're using? I heard they have the remarkable ability to fire many balls at once? Berengar had already prepared an answer for his father. Seeing as cannons of the time were mainly static weapons used in sieges, he decided to lie about the mobility of his 12-pounder cannons and highlight that they were exactly the opposite. A strictly defensive weapon. Have you seen the size of my designs? They are far too large and far too heavy to be used effectively on the field or even during a siege. They're best suited to be mounted on the castle's walls and used as a means of defending our home from any potential threat. At first, Lambert was concerned about such sophisticated weapons falling into the hands of Berengar and his peasant rabble. Still, when he heard his brother say they were entirely defensive in nature, he had no desire to report such useless products to his partner in crime, Count Lothar of Tyrol. The Count needed weapons of war, not weapons of defense. Little did Lambert know that this was all a ploy by Berengar to keep his revolutionary designs as confidential as possible. The likelihood of Lambert or Sigurd having the desire to test the weapons themselves was virtually zero. Eventually, the Baron lost interest in the topic as he heard their use was solely for defending their territory. It appears Berengar was truly content with his position as a Baron's heir and had no loftier ambitions than that. Something in which Sigurd could agree with. Minor noblemen like themselves had no place getting involved in the affairs of the great families. The Baron decided he would leave the peasant militia Berengar had founded as defenders of his family's territory should he ever be called to war again in his lifetime. After all, according to his son, they were practically useless in an offensive manner. Only Berengar was aware of how efficient his forces would become on the field of battle, during a siege, engaging in guerrilla warfare, and especially defense. Yet, he would never inform anyone of their effective capacity to do so. Only when his forces were truly needed would Berengar display the overwhelming power of steel and shot to this feudal world. After finishing breakfast, the family dispersed, and Lambert found time to approach Lind about her recent behavior, something he would utterly regret doing. Berengar had already given her orders to maintain her relationship with Lambert. She would continue to abuse, punish, and degrade him, though she could not sleep with him, nor did she desire to. When Lambert approached the young temptress and grabbed a hold of her wrist, she instinctively slapped him in the face. Her flawless sky-blue eyes contained the fire of a woman's rage as she scolded her toy for touching her perfect skin without her approval. The sound of the slap could be heard throughout the courtyard, which briefly drew the attention of the servants working nearby. "How dare you touch me without my permission? Who do you think you are?" Lind was furious, and it was not just a facade. Only her master could touch her without her consent. Though she no longer held her previous sadistic personality, she was still ordered to abuse the boy, and as such, she would do as her master had commanded. The violent slap left a red handprint on Lambert's face. Now, this was the mistress he knew and lusted after. The truth is that Lambert despised Linda's personality, but he could not help but forgive her many transgressions, for, in his eyes, she was the incarnation of physical perfection. Some men would do anything to please a beautiful woman, and Lambert was one of them. As such, he kneeled before her and apologized. "I'm sorry, mistress, I did not mean to offend. I just wanted to inquire about your progress with Berengar." Lind kept a calm facade. However, she was internally furious that this little punk wanted to assassinate her master. Nevertheless, she had to put her feelings aside and play the part. After all, Berengar had tasked her with spying on Lambert and her father. He even promised her a reward if she did so successfully. "I have not found the ability to be alone with him. He is very wary of my actions and is always around others when I approach him. He's far more cunning than you give him credit for." Lambert felt his heart stinging. Did this bitch seriously compliment his accursed brother? She had never done such a thing for him. This was outrageous, but he could not deny the fact that recently his brother had become quite cunning. It would not surprise him if Berengar had become aware of his plot to use Lind to assassinate him. Eventually, Lambert decided to ask Lind for her plans. After all, she was the one who insisted on getting rid of his brother herself. "So, what exactly is your plan to deal with him?" Lind looked at Lambert as if he was a pitiful fool before giving her a response. "I will keep approaching him as I have been and improve my attempts at seduction, but if he keeps avoiding being alone with me, we will eventually just have to face the potential reality that your brother is too crafty to be caught in a honeypot." A strong frown appeared across Lambert's face as he heard Lind compliment Berengar once more. It seemed she had begun to admire her prey for avoiding her womanly wiles for so long. Lambert began to wonder if there was something wrong with Berengar's head. How could a hot-blooded male in the prime of his youth possibly fail to be seduced by a goddess like Lind? He started to suspect Berengar was a lolicon based upon how he acted towards Adela. If that were the case, it would explain how his brother showed no outward interest towards Lind as the days went on. Only on that first night was there any semblance of lust in Berengar's gaze towards the immaculate young woman. As Lambert was deep in thought, he fled an iron grip on his shoulder and a wicked smile from Lind as she whispered in his ear. More importantly, it seems to me that you have gotten unruly after going undisciplined for so long. It appears I will have to teach you a proper lesson for your sins. Immediately Lambert's expression sank as all the doubts he had about Linda's recent behavior were washed away at that moment. How could he be so foolish as to believe the sadistic dominatrix had changed her colors so easily? It only became apparent now that she was testing him throughout the last week, to see if he would behave differently on his home turf. The young boy began to question every decision he had made since he returned home as he was dragged off to Linda's quarters to be punished severely for his actions. Meanwhile, Berengar continued drilling the peasant militia in the fields, which was increasing in numbers by the day. The magnificent weapons Berengar displayed had attracted the attention of the common population. Those who had survived the battlefield previously as peasant levies could see the age of knights coming to an end as they witnessed the volley fire being followed by an organized bayonet charge which Berengar had commanded his troops to enact as they stabbed their bayonets into the straw dummies. The commander gazed at his troops respectfully. With each day, they were progressing closer to a true army. Ludwig had worked overtime to produce enough arms to keep up with the growing demands of the militia. In the last day alone, they received 50 recruits, making their numbers stand at a firm 300. This was practically half the size of his father's army during a time of war. After all, as a baron, Sigurd could call upon his vassals to mobilize troops of their own so that he may add their forces to his army. Without a doubt, he now had a force the size of a small battalion. Though mostly infantry, there were still a total of 3 cannons, one for every 100 infantry. Albeit a small team of men typically operated cannons, so currently, the ratio was not exact, but it would be soon enough. He looked upon his forces as if they were his own beloved sons, knowing that as long as he did so they would stand by him even unto death. By the time the king had passed and the kingdom of Germany descended into absolute warfare, he would have an army capable of defending his borders from any threat. After all, the likelihood of Berengar marching to the drums of war himself was slim. Sigurd had a passion for such things, and when his liege called upon him to take up arms, he would surely lead the charge. The question on Berengar's mind was whether or not he could convince his father to appoint him as regent by then. If his plans succeeded, he would wield absolute power in his family's territory for an extended period of time, and he could get many of his more important reformations underway. If his father returned from the conflict alive, he would be welcomed to a completely transformed land. For now, Berengar had many tasks at hand which included but were not limited to raising an army, installing his irrigation system across the fields, selling the steel stockpile to the Count of Steiermark, investing the profits into the mining industry, as well as gaining the support of the local nobility and their entitled offspring. Truly an ambitious man like himself never had time to rest. Chapter 22: A Diamond in the Rough. After observing and instructing the peasant militia, Berengar returned to the village. For now, their training was done for the day, and the young lord had business to attend to elsewhere. The baron's son had to say goodbye temporarily to his fiancée, who would be returning to her homeland with 10 tons of steel. 5 more than Berengar had initially estimated. After all, as his plans became more ambitious, his family needed a larger treasury. Though the count's daughter would not be gone for long, she would return with the transport containing the gold and silver bars which were the promised form of compensation for such a massive stockpile of steel ingots. A small portion of the money gained from the transaction would go towards the engagement ceremony that Berengar had planned. Seeing as he was far from beginning preparations for it, he had not sent out the invitations yet. Due to unforeseen circumstances, primarily involving Linda's arrival and the things that occurred afterward, Berengar was far behind schedule on preparing for the party he had promised Adela. Currently, it was his notable lack of funds that hindered his progress in that regard. After arriving at the castle, the young lord approached his fiancée, whose retinue of knights were loading the steel ingots into the convoy which Berengar had prepared for her. He trusted her to keep her father's side of the bargain intact. The cute girl who was at the cusp of her teenage years played with her twintails as she waited patiently for Berengar to arrive. When she finally spotted him, she dashed over into his arms and embraced him firmly. She had grown quite fond of her fiancé since their initial meeting. After several moments had passed, the young girl let go of her hold over her betrothed and pouted. "Are you sure you can't come with me?" Berengar chuckled as he patted her silky golden hair. With such a reaction, he truly wished he could travel with her to the girl's ancestral homeland, but alas, he could not. The young lord had many preparations that needed to be made, and unfortunately, he did not have the spare time to go on a brief vacation with his future wife. He spoke from the bottom of the heart as he smiled endearingly at her. "I wish I could, yet unfortunately, there are many matters I must attend to here. But fret not, you will be back in no time." He tried to assure the young girl that they would not be separated long, as he too had grown quite fond of his young cousin. However, the real trial would be their long-term separation after the engagement ceremony was over, and she was forced to return home. It was not as if she could stay in his family's lands until their wedding. That would not be proper. Truthfully, she had already stayed longer than what was considered acceptable in the eyes of society. It was supposed to be a short meeting of a matter of days, yet she had been in her fiancé's lands for weeks already. The young girl eventually stopped pouting after hearing Berengar's words and smiled at him gratefully as she said in a hushed tone, "Come closer, I want to tell you something." Berengar thought nothing of it and leaned over so that he matched the girl's height. She quickly pecked him on the cheek with her full lips and whispered in his ear, "I'll miss you." Afterward, Berengar stared at her in disbelief. He did not think she had the nerve to do such a thing. As he stared at the young lady, her face became increasingly flushed until the point where she covered her face with her hands and rushed off into her carriage. Berengar instinctively placed his hand on the cheek where she had kissed him as he thought to himself, "This girl is just too cute." As his thoughts began to shift back to the wonderful memories he had made with the Count's daughter over the past weeks, the convoy began to ride off into the distance, leaving Berengar standing alone in the courtyard as the sunset came to a close. It was only after he could no longer see the carriage which contained his fiancée that Berengar decided to walk back inside and take a bath. Berengar sat in the large circular stone pool, the hot water soothing his milky white skin as he washed away the stress accumulated throughout the day. He was completely unaware of the creaking of the door and the sound of footsteps approaching. It was not until he felt the soft and bouncy mounds of his lover press against the back of his neck that he realized someone had intruded on his private time. The girl covered his eyes with her hands from behind as she asked in a playful tone, "Guess who?" Berengar chuckled as he grabbed a hold of the dainty hands and pulled the buxom beauty into the bath with him. Lind was not expecting such behavior and screamed as she splashed into the hot water, her alabaster skin instantly reddening as the heat began to affect her complexion. After climbing into the young lord's lap and pressing her chest against his, she looked at him while pouting. "You got my hair wet." Berengar wrapped his arms around the girl and kissed her. Only after a minute had gone by did he break away from her enticing lips. "It's the bath, of course. Your hair is going to get wet." The young temptress continued to pout as Berengar lectured her, but he paid it no mind. Initially, he was worried somebody might have spotted her sneak in here. After all, people were still wide awake at this hour and roaming across the castle, and thus he could not help but inquire about the girl's recklessness. "Did anyone see you enter here?" She shook her head as she buried it into Berengar's shoulder. Afterward, she pecked him on the opposite cheek that Adela had left her mark and expressed the concerns that were on her mind. "There, now there's no more space for another girl to mark her claim." The young lord nearly broke out in laughter as he heard such a childish remark from the young woman who had just a week prior boldly tried to seduce and enslave him. Was she jealous of his relationship with Adela? This would not do. Clearly, he had to discipline her further. As such, he spent an unusually long and energetic bath with the naked bombshell who lay next to him. It would not be for close to an hour before the couple retreated from the confines of the bathhouse and entered Berengar's chambers where the real fun began. He spent an entire night further training his slave. After all, her jealousy was unbefitting of a proper slave. It was not her place to question whether or not her master spent time with another woman. By the time the sun rose, the couple was well and truly exhausted. Berengar began to regret his decisions in life as he knew there was still a matter of lifting weights to attend to. Though intercourse was great for cardio, it was far from enough to increase his muscle mass further. After sending his lover back to her chambers, he spent the rest of the morning getting in his old exercise routine, which he had been slacking on lately. It did not surprise him that it took him longer than usual to complete his sets after an entire night of lovemaking. He would need to fit power naps into his schedule if he continued to behave in this manner at night. Nevertheless, he had plenty of work to do, so after his exercise for the day was concluded, as well as the morning bath, he had once more dined with his family. The meal was uneventful and mainly included small talk. Afterward, Berengar returned to the fledgling industrial district where he checked on the progress of the irrigation pipes. Things were going smoothly, and truthfully all he had to do at this point was wait for production to be complete. His workforce was already stretched thin on the production of arms, munitions, and irrigation piping. At this point, there was no way for him to increase their workload to produce more designs. It was not until the irrigation piping was finished that he would see more peasants enter the industrial sector. After all, with the innovation fully fielded, there was no longer a need for so many farmers to water their crops by hand, and they would need a new occupation. Most would be delegated to the mines, while others would be working in the factories. It was not a glamorous life, but they would be paid a fair wage under Berengar's management and be allotted a proper 40-hour workweek with paid vacation time and sick days. It was best not to overwork your employees. If you were foolish enough to do so, you would see decreased productivity. These were lessons that could only be learned through experience. Luckily for Berengar, he had the history of 21st century America and the lessons it could teach in the back of his mind thanks to the memories of Julian. It seemed that for now, his days would be primarily filled with overseeing the training of his volunteer militia. At least until Adela returned with the fortune he had obtained for his family through his many efforts. If at all possible, he would request a small portion of the profits for himself to purchase some land to grow flax on. With the inventions that dwelled within his mind, he could produce a flourishing textile industry with time and introduce the fashion of the Renaissance to his population, which he vastly preferred over the garments currently in fashion. Anything left over could be sold for a fair price to the neighboring regions. These were all plans for the near future. For now, nothing of significance could be achieved without the wealth to invest in it, which he severely lacked at the moment, though within a few weeks, that would no longer be a concern. He supposed he should enjoy the spare time he had available to him at the moment, but for some reason, if he did not fill his schedule with meaningful and productive activities, he felt like an idle wastrel. After checking on the progress of his industrial sector, he returned to the peasant militia, which was currently going over basic formations. Berengar had specifically chosen some veterans from the peasant population who had served in previous wars as levies to act as the officer class. They had true experience in the horrors of war. After being personally educated in line infantry tactics by Berengar himself, they had begun to form their own ranks. Of course, Berengar oversaw the daily training in tactics as much as possible to correct any errors. After all, these were revolutionary strategies and tactics in which had never been seen before. As such, he needed to lead the growth of his unit personally. His second in command was actually a knight-errant who had chosen to settle in Kufstein and lays about after many years of war. If one were to compare his situation to feudal Japan, he was essentially a ronin. A member of the military class whose lord had perished in battle, and with it his prosperity and land rights. The knight-errant named Eckhard von Hallstatt had lived in Kufstein for nearly 5 years and essentially lived as a beggar and a drunkard during that duration. It was not until he saw the militia and its unique weaponry and tactics that he decided to clean up his act and make something of his life. He had a keen eye for strategy and tactics, and unlike the other knights and men-at-arms in Kufstein, he was intelligent enough to realize that Berengar's militia was the future of warfare. As an old and grizzled veteran, Eckhard had many insights to which he could contribute. He had approached Berengar earlier in the week and offered the young lord his own rusty sword in fealty. After hearing the old veteran's story, Berengar appointed him major of the battalion and his right-hand man. Berengar had spent many hours of the night writing a military treatise on his vision of the future of warfare and the necessary strategies, tactics, and logistics to conduct it. Eckhard had practically treated this text as a holy book, and the more he read about Berengar's vision, the more he believed the young lord to be a military genius. Though Berengar was by no means a military genius, As a longtime veteran of various strategy games set in numerous eras and a graduate of Westpoint Academy, he could confidently say his skills were at the very least advanced for the time period. Eckhard did not disappoint Berengar's expectations. The man in his mid-40s had quickly grasped everything he was taught and was not simply following the book but effectively improvising when it was called for. If anything, Eckhard was the true military genius. It was a pity that his previous lord did not recognize the knight's talents in strategy and instead sent him to fight on the front lines. As far as Berengar could tell, it was likely to be a factor in the foolish lord's death. Truly, Eckhard was a diamond in the rough. Though the militia was entirely volunteer-based, they still received pay for their training and activity. Essentially, they would act in a fashion similar to America's National Guard in Berengar's previous life. The men who comprised its ranks would go through basic and specialized training, and after they had completed, they would be normal civilians who would meet up on weekends to continue their training. The primary difference is that Berengar wanted his militia training every weekend instead of just once a month. In a time of need, they would be called upon to fulfill their duty and be held to the same standards as a professional force, with the same penalties for desertion or other crimes. Berengar treated the men of his militia exceptionally well. He supplied them with proper meals during their training, and soon he would give them proper uniforms. Once his textile industry was up and running, the men would be outfitted in the attire of the L and SN Checht of the 16th century from Berengar's previous life. The young lord was beginning to develop a flamboyant fashion sense, much like his father. For now, the volunteer militia still wore their everyday ensemble, which, truth be told, was not very professional. After guiding the battalion's training for the day, Berengar departed back to the castle where he intended to spend the rest of his waking hours drafting the plans for his soon-to-be textile industry. Time waited for no man, and soon he would acquire the funds to make his dream a reality. Thus he had to work hard and not be tempted by any worldly desires. Of course, after several hours of drafting blueprints, Berengar heard a knock on his door and could not resist the temptation to play with his favorite toy for the remainder of the night. Chapter 23: A new plot is hatched. A few days had passed without any major occurrence. Berengar had found himself getting dreadfully bored as his work schedule appeared to have come to a halt. Due to the trustworthy and competent people he had placed in implementing his innovations, he had recently acquired an asinine amount of free time. If Adela were still within the confines of his family's territory, then he would currently be enjoying her company. Unfortunately, she would not return to Kufstein for a few weeks. As such, Berengar recently found himself training in the art of swordsmanship with his personal retainer Eckhard. The two men were currently sparring with a pair of wooden arming swords, in which Eckhard was thoroughly beating the young lord who had never picked up a sword until a few days ago. Swordsmanship was an art that took many years to master, and unlike the flintlock musket required a great deal of physical strength, stamina, and finesse to become adequate. Despite its age coming to an end, Berengar still felt it a necessity to learn how to properly wield a sword. After all, as an officer leading the army that he was creating, it was only proper for him to wield a sword and pistol. Though the more he trained in the sword, the more he realized he would probably break the tradition from his old world and just use a musket. At the moment, Berengar found himself parrying the oncoming wooden sword currently wielded by Eckhard before unleashing a counterattack of his own. However, just when he was about to land his strike, Eckhard dodged in the nick of time and followed up with a thrust of his own, pointing the blade directly at Berengar's neck. Seeing that all was lost, Berengar fully surrendered to his instructor. "I yield." With that said, the middle-aged man retracted his sword with a smile on his face and placed it back with the others. "You're a quick learner, and you have the potential to become a competent swordsman. It's just a shame that its era will be coming to an end so soon." Berengar placed his sword alongside Eckhard's as he sighed heavily in response to the knight's words. "The true shame is that I was incapable of training with the sword until now." The middle-aged knight nodded in agreement to Berengar's statement. He had become aware of the difficulties Berengar faced throughout his years, particularly about his health. It was a miracle that he overcame such an illness and became the man he is today. This transformation of body and mind is just another part of Berengar's character, which inspired Eckhard to do his best every day. After placing away the swords and stripping out of the training gear they currently equipped, the two men walked together back to the fields, which were being used as a training ground for the militia. The men who comprised the militia's ranks had come a long way in a short amount of time, but their training was still incomplete. It would take close to 90 days in total for the militia to be competent enough to act as a proper force. After all, these men were learning how to use firearms for the first time in their lives. Currently, the unit was split up into 4 infantry companies with 80 men in each. There was also an artillery battery trained alongside the infantry, though it was not a full-sized battery. At this point, the battery had 3 12-pounder cannons and roughly 40 personnel. It was approximately 1/3 the size of a proper artillery battery. Nevertheless, the numbers of the militia grew with each passing day, and a 4th gun was on the way. What he desired at a bare minimum was a small infantry battalion of 400 soldiers and a full-sized artillery battery. So at the very least, 520 men in his militia and 8 cannons. This was something that was actually quite feasible with his current progress. After all, these were not professional soldiers who would have to give up their day jobs. The quota Berengar had set himself for a bare-bones battalion would soon be met. The most difficult part was the manufacture of the cannons. Those would take time. Still, it was not as if the war would break out overnight. Though the king was in poor health, he was not in critical condition at the moment. Despite the fact that he could potentially croak at any moment, the likelihood of the old man dying before Berengar had reached his militia goals was slim. After overseeing the training of the militia with Eckhard for the afternoon, Berengar returned to the castle where, unbeknownst to him, he found himself being stalked in the shadows. As he passed through the winding corridor of the castle, his pursuer finally revealed herself from the darkness. It was none other than Lind, who had a worried expression on her face as she embraced Berengar from behind. Not expecting such a thing to occur, Berengar instinctively struggled out of the grasp before realizing who had attacked him. Afterward, he calmed down and accepted her tight embrace. Lind whispered in his ear so low that only they could hear the words. "Your brother is going to make another attempt on your life soon." Immediately Berengar's expression sank. It was a good thing he had properly trained this girl. Here he was walking around carelessly expecting himself to be safe from Lambert's schemes, and yet the boy had already plotted his death. He was immediately intrigued by the information she provided him. How does he plan to do it? Lind revealed Lambert's secrets without a second of hesitation. She had long since turned on the boy and her father. "He has grown tired of my attempts to stall him and has impatiently contacted my father for aid. Apparently, your father is planning a hunting trip. Lambert and my father have arranged for assassins to lie in wait for you in the mountains. They will appear as brigands, but they will secretly be men-at-arms under my father's command." Berengar patted the girl's silky strawberry blonde hair and comforted her. She was aware that Berengar was not much of a fighter and could not defend himself adequately against such a force. As such, she had a distraught expression across her face that soured her natural beauty, and Berengar hated to see such a thing. The young lord grabbed a hold of her chin and kissed her passionately in the empty corridors of the large stone castle. After releasing her, he whispered in her tender ear, "You don't need to worry so much, I'm stronger than I look." Linda's cheeks immediately flushed after Berengar had so brazenly kissed her in the middle of the hallway. Sure, there was nobody around, but what if somebody nearby had chanced upon them during their little affair? It was a reckless move on his part, but she could not help but feel excited. The thrill of potentially being discovered was something that made her heart race. However, she realized now was not the moment to engage in her desires with her master. Instead, she bowed respectfully to Berengar, who had noticed the complicated expression on the girl's face. His brain instantly connected the dots as he realized the girl might be developing a new fetish. A wicked smile appeared across the young lord's face as he pushed the exquisite young lady against the wall and began to partake of her flesh. Luckily for him, nobody came nearby as the couple engaged in scandalous behavior openly in the middle of the castle's corridors. By the time they were finished, the sun had already begun to set, and they realized their absence would soon be noticed. As such, they parted ways until they were capable of meeting up again at dinner. This time the atmosphere at the dinner table was quite tense, as Lambert eyed Berengar like a hungry wolf, and Berengar sneered inwardly at the boy like an all-seeing owl. Lambert had no way of knowing that his scheme had already been revealed to his most hated brother, who was already concocting a plan to deal with the plot against him. It was not until their father had spoken up that the silence was broken. "Berengar, my son, now that you are healthy and fit, I think it is about time I take you on a hunting trip. What do you say?" Berengar had an innocent smile on his face, like a kid at the candy store, as he expressed his interest in joining up with his father as they explored the mountains which bordered their family's territory and hunted some wild game. "Of course, father, that sounds splendid. Now that I eat meat, I can't wait to feel what it is like to dine on the flesh of my own kill." Despite his innocent facade, Berengar was inwardly snickering at his brother Lambert, who had bought into the display and expected his plan to function flawlessly. On the other hand, Sigurd had no way of knowing the battle of intrigue that was transpiring at this very moment between his two sons. Instead, he felt happy knowing that Berengar was so welcome to the idea. After all, until recently, Berengar was a vegetarian who had a soft spot for animals. To see the boy so excited about hunting truly brought joy to the Baron's heart. He may be getting older, and his son may be an adult now, but the two still had the potential to grow closer. Lambert was pleased. His brother was falling right into the trap he had prepared. After all, he could no longer sit idly by and allow Lind constantly to fail at seducing his brother. Berengar was either impotent, gay, or a lolicon. That was the conclusion Lambert had come to. If he had known that his gorgeous fiancée he was so proud of had been ravaged openly in the hallway by his brother just an hour earlier, the boy would probably attempt to claim Berengar's life on the spot. The young lord had no way of knowing that Berengar had planned to bring a rifle to a sword fight. That's right, a rifle. In his spare time over the past few days, he had drawn designs for a barrel-boring bench and presented them to Ludwig. This invention would be instrumental to the effectiveness of his army. Currently, Ludwig was in the process of making a long rifle-style gun that was used effectively by American militias during the Revolutionary War in Berengar's previous life. For now, Berengar's militia would be equipped with smoothbores. After all, he really could not reveal the effectiveness of the rifled musket without garnering suspicion about such a design. However, if he were alone and separated from his father in the mountains, he could easily kill the assassins from a distance of 200 to 300 yards with a long rifle. He may be useless in the sword, but in his past life as Julian, he had earned his expert marksman badge during his tenure in the army. By the time the hunting trip began, Berengar would be well equipped to deal with the assassins, as long as he spotted them first, that is. If they got close to him for whatever reason, he had specifically designed this rifle to be capable of using a bayonet, something with which he also had ample experience training in. For now, he just had to act like he had no idea what Lambert was scheming behind his back and go along with the ploy. The two brothers had a pleasant conversation with their father about the finer details of hunting and all Berengar should know about it. It was only after dinner that Berengar returned to his quarters to get some work done. Currently, he was drafting designs or keeping track of ledgers, the usual administrative operations he had been engaging in at night ever since his father gave him jurisdiction over the fledgling industrial sector. When he was not signing documents related to the industry, he oversaw reports of military spending and training. Everything was currently within his budget, and the troops seemed to be progressing well. So there were no immediate concerns he had to deal with there. It was not until midnight that he heard the knock on his door that he had grown so accustomed to over the last couple of weeks. This girl was voracious. Even after having fun in the middle of the day, she still came for more at night. Well, he supposed he should take a break from reports and relieve a little stress. As such, he spent part of the night training his slave before the couple fell asleep in each other's arms. It would not be until the crack of dawn where they awoke from their slumber. Chapter 24. It is not a hunt if you are properly sober. Over the next few days, Berengar had made preparations for the hunting trip. While also working on the many other tasks he was currently micromanaging. As usual, everything was progressing smoothly, but he could not increase productivity until the irrigation pipes were fully installed and the mines were working at full capacity. Thus it was mainly just basic administrative operations he was forced to oversee every day, which began to take its toll on Berengar, who desperately needed an escape. He was actually looking forward to the hunting trip, as he would enjoy the fresh air of the mountains and take care of some pesky gnats that were conspiring against him. The day they were set to leave the castle, Berengar had stopped by Ludwig's shop to pick up his rifle, which should be ready by then. When he walked through the dusty old doors of Ludwig's shack, which was now used as office space for the growing industrial district, he noticed the old man cleaning the rifle's barrel before a wide smile spread across his lips. "So you've taken a liking to my newest design, huh?" Ludwig quickly snapped to attention as he heard the young lord's voice calling out to him. "My lord, It is brilliant. Who knew that by cutting grooves into the barrel, you could stabilize the lead ball's flight through the air, thus achieving a greater degree of accuracy? It was a rhetorical question, of course. There was only one mind in this world capable of thinking of such a thing, and that was Berengar's. Ludwig politely handed the rifle over to Berengar, in which he thoroughly inspected. When he saw the proof mark on the barrel showing that it had been properly test-fired, a smile crept upon his regal visage. "Ludwig, you're an artist," Berengar said as he looked up and complimented the old man. By now, he had made hundreds of firearms that were used to equip the militia, yet this was the first rifle the man had ever made, and it was a masterpiece. The rifle was chambered in .58 caliber and fired a mini-ball projectile, a lead slug that was far more effective than the current lead balls used by his militia. The mini-ball was matched specifically to the rifling so that it stabilized better in its flight, thus giving it a more effective range than the traditional lead ball. With the overwhelming barrel length of the long rifle, matched with the superior mini-ball, he felt as if the practical range of accuracy on this rifle was greater than the 1861 Springfield rifled musket used by Union troops in the American Civil War in his previous life. After clasping Ludwig's shoulder, Berengar thanked him for his service. "You have no idea how much this means to me, my friend." Ludwig removed Berengar's hand and remained humble. "I'm just doing what I should. Make sure to get some proper use out of this thing on your hunting trip, my lord. It would be a pity if you failed to kill anything with such a beautiful weapon." Berengar smiled at Ludwig and said farewell to his friend. It would be a few days before returning. "I'll be gone for the next few days. Make sure to keep an eye on things around here when I'm gone." Ludwig chuckled as he parted ways with his friend while reassuring him of his competence. "You do not need to be afraid, my lord. Everything will be running smoothly by the time you return." Afterward, Berengar departed from the shop with a rifle in hand and a belt that contained his bayonet and cartridge holder for his paper cartridges. Today he had dressed in earthly colors, mostly green and brown, so that he may blend in with the environment better. He did not want the assassins who would be waiting for him in the mountains to spot him before he did them. With Linda's warning, he could now successfully stalk the assassins and take them out from hundreds of meters away. The hunted had become the hunter. Speaking of Lind, as he left the shop and rounded a corner in the village, a pair of dainty hands reached out and grabbed a hold of his waist, as he felt the familiar softness of Linda's heavenly bust pressed against his back. When he turned around to face her, he could see tears in her eyes as she wished him good luck. "Stay safe out there. I don't think I could live without you." Berengar nearly laughed at her remark. Her training was going wonderfully. She was now a properly broken-in slave who would never betray him. After observing her angelic face, which was covered in tears, he reached out his index finger and wiped them from her sky-blue eyes with his finger before kissing her farewell. "I know," is all the young lord said as he walked away from his lover with a confident stride, slinging the rifle on his back as he did so. Berengar eventually regrouped with his father and a small host of men to accompany them. Their journey would be a long one, and thus they needed men to carry supplies with them. Berengar found that he had slung the rifle over his shoulder. A leather sling was attached to the steel sling points that hung beneath the rifle's stock. After many miles of hiking, Berengar was thankful to whoever came up with such an idea in his previous life. It made long marches far more bearable, and today he had hiked many miles into the mountains. The sun had begun to set, and as such, Berengar's servants had set up the encampment for them. They had finally reached a wooded portion of the mountains, his father's favorite hunting spot. It had been a long while since Sigurd had last been here, and he took a moment to enjoy the scenery before passing a wineskin to his son, who was currently cradling his rifle like it was a newborn babe. "Drink. It is not a hunt if you are properly sober." Though Berengar wanted to keep his mind sober as he knew there was a dastardly plot to end his life nearby, he couldn't very well refuse his father. So he took a swig from the wineskin and wiped his lips with his sleeve before returning it to his father. Sigurd could not understand his son's fascination with hand cannons. It was hardly a proper tool for hunting. Yet the youth had brought an even larger hand cannon out than his previous one. He began to wonder what was so special about the design. Nevertheless, he would not chastise the boy for liking the weapon. He just wished his heir was as good as his second son with the sword. Berengar, on the other hand, was thinking of the information Lind reported to him the night before. Lambert's assassins should be camping out just out of hearing range for the sound of his rifle. which worked perfectly for Berengar as he had decided that he would launch a night raid. Seeing as how the full moon was out, there was plenty of illumination for him to pick off his targets, especially if they stood by the fire. When his father finally fell asleep, Berengar would take the high ground and snipe his enemies from above. After he got rid of them, he would search for any evidence among their bodies that could be used against his enemies. As such, Berengar spent a lot of time getting his father drunk. It was only after the man could barely stand that Berengar led him back to his tent and tucked the old drunkard in. After leaving his father's tent behind, Berengar snuck around the campsite and picked up the rifle where he absconded into the night. Along the way, he slathered mud in his hair and across his face and hands to blend into the darkness better. It was quite the trek up to the position where he wanted to take control of. However, before he arrived at the outcropping, Berengar had a sudden encounter with someone he was not expecting. One of the assassins had left the camp to take a leak, and while Berengar was sneaking past the area, the two came face to face with one another. Though the man could not tell Berengar's identity, it was not a good idea to allow a witness to their location to live. As such, the man instantly grabbed his sword and swung it out of his scabbard as he attacked Berengar in the dead of night. Berengar had to roll out of the way as he struggled to fix his bayonet. The fucking rifle wasn't even loaded yet, nor was the bayonet attached. As such, he had elected to hide behind a tree while he attached the blade to his rifle. The man was just about to scream for help from his comrades when he walked by the tree Berengar hid behind and noticed a giant steel spike insert itself into his neck. Instantly feeling the sharp pain of a bayonet stuck in his throat, the man began to gargle on his own blood as he looked at Berengar in disbelief. Since when did this guy have a spear? Berengar removed the bayonet from the man's throat and wiped it across his jerkin. It had been quite some time since Berengar last killed somebody. He served as an engineer officer in the United States Army in his previous life, but he had found himself engaged in combat on more than one occasion. He even managed to kill a Taliban insurgent while he came under fire from their assault. As such, he was no virgin when it came to taking a life. After confirming the men in the camp were unalerted, Berengar snuck up to the position above the campfire where he saw 3 more assassins sitting in front of the fire and drinking. After acquiring his targets, Berengar took out a paper cartridge and bit off its top before pouring its contents into his muzzle and packing it down with the ramrod. Once the round was properly chambered, he pulled back the hammer that contained the flint and aimed down the sights, which landed on the largest group member, who appeared to be dressed in brigandine armor. The man heartfully chugged down a flagon of wine, completely unaware that he was in the sniper's sights. Berengar took a deep breath as he settled the sights on his target and calmly squeezed the trigger. The thunder of the explosion which propelled the mini-ball projectile filled the air. Having never heard such a sound before, these men-at-arms turned assassin thought that it had begun raining. After all, they were young upstarts who wanted to prove themselves to the Count. Hand cannons were not that common on the battlefield at this point. One of the assassins looked back at the man who had an enormous hole in his brigandine breastplate with shock. Blood spurted from the caved-in hole in the man's chest as he soon collapsed. The others had no idea what had just transpired, but they were beginning to panic. As they were freaking out about the loss of their friend, a second thunder went off. This time, the head of one of the assassins exploded. The last survivor instantly hid behind one of the crates lying about the campsite. It had become obvious after the second occasion that they were under attack from an unknown enemy and weapon. Unfortunately for the young assassin, he had chosen poorly in regards to cover. After another a minute or so had passed, the .58 caliber slug pierced through the wooden crate, and the contents within penetrating its way through the man's leg, practically blasting his femur in half. He would bleed out shortly thereafter from a damaged femoral artery. Just like that, Berengar had claimed the lives of the 4 assassins who were sent after him. After having sent the men to the afterlife, Berengar rushed down to the camp below and scoured it for any evidence that could be used against Lambert or Lothar. Luckily he came across the letter which contained the details of Berengar and Sieghard's hunting trip, including the general location in which Sieghard always set up his campsite. It was signed by Lambert and in his handwriting. Berengar nearly broke out in laughter upon obtaining this letter. He finally had a key piece of evidence in which he could begin to build a case against Lambert's assassination attempts. Throughout the remainder of the night, Berengar used his time wisely and got rid of any sign pointing towards his bloody deed. He did not want the Count's men sniffing around and finding out that he had personally dispatched his men at arms to hell. After everything was either buried or burned to ash, Berengar had left the area behind and returned to his own camp night. As if God were looking out for him, the heavens began to weep that night and washed any remaining sign of the skirmish. After a covert investigation, the Count would later assume that the men had abandoned their duties and fled Tyrol. He would later place a bounty for their heads, which nobody was ever able to claim. For the rest of the night, Berengar slept like a baby. He had no second thoughts about murdering those men who were sent to kill him. Not even a tinge of guilt could infect his pure consciousness or lack thereof as he enjoyed the sound of the pounding rain outside of his warm tent, which slowly aided him in drifting to sleep. His last thought of the night was simply, this fucking hunting trip, I could be playing with Lind right now. Chapter 25 Returning Home. Throughout the entire venture, Berengar's absence throughout the camp went entirely unnoticed. By the time Sigurd and the servants awoke, they saw Berengar cleaning his rifle next to the fire. Sigurd could not help but exclaim in his heart, "This boy is too dutiful. Even on a hunting trip, he awakes at the crack of dawn." It had become a habit for Berengar to awake at dawn, in both his previous life and his current one. By now, he was used to running on a few hours of sleep a couple of times a week. In his hands was a glass of water which he had boiled over the campfire to rid it of impurities, at least to the best of his ability. He refused to drink polluted water and had spent the morning purifying a large supply of it. Since coffee had yet to be transported to Europe, he was forced to drink water this early in the morning. He was beginning to consider expanding his territory when he came to power. It would not be easy to establish a trade route from the mountains of Austria to the Near East, and if he wanted to retire in luxury one day, he would need coffee. Berengar's plans were simple: work hard for 30 years in establishing an industrial and economic powerhouse in his family's territory, and then retire in luxury, giving the reins to a well-educated heir to continue his legacy. As of now, he had no desire to spend the remainder of his adult life at war. Something he had managed to do in his previous life. Of course, life did not always go as planned, and the future was unknown to him. There may be a necessity for him to expand his territory in time. As of now, he was still just the son and heir of a lowly baron, which meant he had no authority to make such decisions even if he desired to do so. Instead, he spent the remainder of the next few days being dragged around by his father hunting stags and collecting the meat. When he finally returned home, he was exhausted and covered in grime. The first thing he wanted to do was take a bath and cleanse himself of the filth he was covered in. Throughout the duration of the hunting trip, he had never revealed the full capabilities of the rifle. Despite successfully hunting a buck of his own, his father was not impressed with the limited range that was displayed, and the exceptional reload time of the rifle. The man had a traditional mind and felt that Berengar's use of what he incorrectly referred to as hand cannons were merely the fascination of youth with the newest technology. If he had known that the previous night Berengar had taken out 3 targets in a matter of minutes at a distance of 100 yards in the dead of night with his rifle, then he would probably have a heart attack from the shock of such a thing. Unlike an arrow, the rifle which fired a mini-ball projectile was fully capable of piercing through a knight's hardened steel breastplate, let alone a common brigandine. Even the muskets fielded by Berengar's militia were capable of such a feat, albeit at a severely reduced distance. There was a reason that during Berengar's previous life, after the invention of muskets, body armor slowly disappeared from common use. Even with the advanced manufacturing processes of the Renaissance and the surpassing era, the breastplates used by heavy cavalry were only useful against melee weapons and musket fire at long distances. At close range, the steel breastplates used by cuirassiers would be punched through by a musket ball like an arrow through a common tunic. If the medieval knights of the current era charged on horseback against a firing line of musketeers, they would be ended up as a bunch of blood-filled sieves, and such a frightening spectacle would be sure to affect the morale of the soldiers behind them. Even Berengar's militiamen who wielded such terrifying power had no way of knowing how capable their weapons were. After all, it is not as if they tested their guns on straw dummies covered in steel plate armor. That would be ludicrously expensive. Only Berengar was aware that his militia was capable of such an incredible achievement. After arriving in the village with his father and the servants who followed them into the mountains, Berengar noticed a familiar sight waving towards him in an alleyway. It was his loyal slave who currently had tears of joy in her eyes that he had safely returned. The entire time he was away, the pitiful young lady was in constant fear that her lord and master, whom she had pledged her life to, had perished in the ambush set up by her dastardly fiancé. When she saw him covered in the dirt and grime of the mountains, she could not help but smile. There was not even a scratch on him. Truly, she had worried too much. Without arousing suspicion, Berengar approached the alleyway where she was currently alone. As he finally fell out of sight, Lind rushed over into his embrace and nuzzled her porcelain cheek against his chest, dirtying it in the process. Berengar accepted her embrace as he petted her sleek strawberry blonde hair in an attempt to calm her down. He had only been gone a few days and felt that she was overreacting. Nevertheless, he did not scold her, as he actually felt happy that she cared enough to worry so much about him during his absence. After all, their relationship was complicated, to say the least. She was his concubine and brother's fiancée whom he had forced himself on, and practically brainwashed into being obedient to him. Though he did not feel remorse for such actions, ultimately in Berengar's mind such actions were justified, and the young lady deserved her fate. After stroking her luscious red gold hair for several moments, Berengar responded kindly to the young woman. "See, I told you I would be fine." Though she still continued to sniffle, the buxom beauty wiped the tears from her eyes and began to smile. Everything turned out fine, and she could not be happier. However, Berengar could not abide the muck that had spread across her doll-like face and heavenly body from their brief intimate moment. As such, he whispered into the girl's ear, "Meet me in the bath." The girl nodded her head and smiled as he departed before her. Things would not bode well for the couple if she was caught following him into the bath. As such, they had to be extra cautious about how they moved from here on out. And with that being said, Berengar took off and headed towards the bath. Lind waited a few moments and did as she was commanded. Not long after, the young vixen found herself enjoying the company of her master in the warm water of the bathhouse, which proved to be a worthy investment. By the time the two were finished getting reacquainted with one another, it had already turned into evening. Dinner would soon be approaching, and he knew his father would have his chefs cook their gains during the hunt into a lavish feast. As such, the two left the confines of the bathhouse and separated. It would not look good if they arrived at the dining room together. When Berengar finally entered the dining room, he saw Lambert with a wicked smile on his face. He was the first to arrive, and the teenage youth was certain he would be enjoying the feast without his older brother this night. However, when he saw the handsome features of his older brother walk into the area, the young boy instantly went pale, with the expression that he was witnessing a ghost. How could it be possible that his brother had survived the ambush he had set in place? Nevertheless, Berengar sat down across from Lambert and snickered at the boy, savoring his distraught expression to the fullest. He was beginning to think he might have become a true sadist after his many nights with Lind, as he now enjoyed the suffering of his enemies on a deeply personal level. The expression on Berengar's face told Lambert all he needed to know about the fate of the assassins he sent. However, Berengar would never admit to it. If he bragged about killing 4 assassins, nobody would believe him, and those who did would instantly question how a young man with no combat training whatsoever had managed to defeat 4 brigands by his lonesome. Eventually, the effectiveness of his rifle would be discovered, and his weapon designs would no belong to him alone. Eventually, the rest of the family arrived, and Lambert had heard the tales of his father and brother's exploits from the Baron himself. Yet, there was not a single mention of the men who were supposed to ambush them. Is it possible that the Count's men were unreliable and deserted? Then what was with Berengar's smug grin earlier? Eventually, Lambert concluded that the men could have deserted and decided to write a letter to Count Lothar informing him of the operation's failure. Secretly, Count Lothar would send a party to investigate the last known coordinates of his men at arms and come to the same judgment. For now, Berengar could relax and enjoy the new dishes, which used the venison of their hunt as the meat of choice. Berengar savored the taste of venison. Truly, it was one of the best meats a man could dine upon. After finishing his meal, he returned to his quarters. He needed to brush up on his history of this world. After all, it had been some time since he read about the many changes in the timeline from the world he once knew, and he would need to become accustomed to his surroundings if he wished to prepare for the upcoming war. Berengar arrived at his chambers and quickly latched the door behind him. He opened up a scroll and spread it across his desk, the oil lamp in the corner providing the proper illumination necessary to view it. Truly, it was different from his own timeline. The year was 1417, yet the Holy Roman Empire was at the height of its power. On the map in the center of Europe lay the Holy Roman Empire, whose borders stretched beyond their peak in 1138 to encompass all of Italy aside from the Papal States, as well as all of the regions that would one day consist of the Netherlands and Belgium. The empire had also annexed the Teutonic state as a vassal territory extending into the Baltic. The Teutonic state was still a force to be reckoned in its own right, as it was victorious in the Battle of Grunwald in this timeline. The victory sparked an extended campaign that lasted 5 years. During this campaign, the Teutonic Order had conquered all of the coastal regions of the Baltic from Pomerania to the borders of Finland. Though the Teutonic state held the authority of its own kingdom, it was essentially a theocratic vassal state of the empire and a puppet of the Pope. As such, its Grand Master was not afforded the ability to vote upon the next emperor, unlike the kings who presided over the other kingdoms. The feudal system of the Holy Roman Empire in this timeline was far more streamlined, splitting into a very linear vassal system instead of the complex and convoluted semi-autonomous regions of Berengar's previous life. The Holy Roman Empire was comprised of several kingdoms including the Kingdom of Germany, the Kingdom of Italy, the Kingdom of Bohemia, the Swiss Confederation, and the Kingdom of Burgundy. The leaders of these territories were kings in their own right and held varying control over the vassals beneath them, which were split into duchies. These dukes ruled over the various counts whose land comprised the territory of the duchy, and the counts presided over the barons, who in turn presided over minor lords and their knights. Berengar currently resided in the Barony of Kufstein, a vassal region of the County of Tyrol, which was a vassal of the Duchy of Austria, the southernmost duchy of the Kingdom of Germany. The Duchy of Austria in this timeline was far larger than in Berengar's previous life at this point in history. The size of the Archduchy of Austria included the counties of Tyrol, Vorarlberg, Salzburg, Carinthia, Trient, Lower Steiermark-Kärnten, Upper Austria, and Lower Austria, and finally Steiermark, which was the region ruled by his fiancé's father, Count Otto von Gratz. Seeing as how Gratz was the seat of power of the county and where his family derived its name from. Aside from the changes with the Holy Roman Empire and its vassal states, Western Europe, Scandinavia, and the British Isles held the same territory in this timeline as they had in Berengar's past life. Even the Reconquista was going exactly as it had in the other timeline. The only other major change to the geography of Europe was the Balkans being held by the Byzantine Empire, which had over the centuries since the Crusades to the Holy Land recovered much of its lost territory. Extending from the Balkans, through Greece and Anatolia, all the way into the Levant. Though it has not yet been able to reclaim its former North African regions, it was currently doing so. Despite it being the late medieval ages, Europe had begun to take its place in the world as a powerhouse. However, they were far from reaching their full potential. Berengar gazed at the changes of the map with a growing sense of ambition. He was beginning to get the suspicion that being a baron was not his destiny. In the back of his mind, the thought of reaching greater heights began to manifest. He did not know what the future held for him, but now was not the time to think about it. He had plenty of work that needed to be done, and much of it could not be accomplished until he held absolute control of his family's lands. For now, he had to be patient and play the long game. Soon enough, the Kingdom of Germany would find itself embroiled in civil war, and he had to convince his father to declare him regent before that happened. The hunting trip had not been a complete and total waste of time. He was capable of stopping his brother's wicked plans and grow closer to his father. Gaining his father's trust would be paramount for his plans to acquire power. With that being said, Berengar heard a knock on the door and decided to end his studies for the day. He initially thought the knock on his door was most likely going to be Lind, and he could spend some time relaxing with his favorite toy. However, when he opened the door, he saw little Henrietta looking up at him with a frightened expression. The young girl held her favorite doll in her hands as she looked up at her big brother with tears in her eyes. "Big brother, I had a nightmare. Will you read me a story?" It had been a while since Berengar had told his little sister a bedtime story. After all, he had been occupied with other things during the night as of late. As such, he let out a sigh and pet her silky blonde hair as he led the little girl to her room, where he spent the next hour telling her the story of the Battle of Castle Itter during the Second World War in his previous life, where German and American forces came together to free prisoners of war from the Waffen-SS days before the end of the conflict had occurred. His fantastical telling of machine guns, tanks, and cannons, as well as the brotherhood forged between former foes, enthralled the little girl who thought her brother was making up such an incredible story. In the end, Henrietta fell asleep from overexcitement, and Berengar kissed her on the forehead before leaving her room and returned to his own quarters. When he returned, Berengar had found Lind lying naked on his bed, waiting for his arrival with a pouting expression on her lips. Damn this girl, she was just too sinful. The young lord immediately closed the door to his chambers behind him and enjoyed the company of the beautiful young woman for the night. Chapter 26. The Count's daughter returns. Days turned to weeks as time flew by. During this time, Berengar had been primarily overseeing the growth of the militia. By now, he had met his minimum infantry goals: 4 companies of 100 men each. The artillery battery was properly taking shape as well, with 80 men and 5 guns. It would not be long until he had reached his minimum goal, but in his mind, that was not good enough. He now desired a full-sized battalion and 2 artillery batteries before the war began. Though their training continued, it was done in such a manner that, when observed by outsiders, highlighted the limitations of the weapons. As such, Lambert never once felt the need to report the mass use of hand cannons and field guns to his allies, and Sieghard had no desire to conscript Berengar's forces into his standing army, which all played perfectly into the young lord's hands. Berengar was in a perfect mood today, as today was the day in which Adela returned from her trip to her homeland. Not only did he miss the company of his little fiancée, but he also desired the gold and silver hoard she would bring with her in payment to the 10 tons of steel he had sold to her father. With it, the next phase of expansion could begin to take place. Berengar, alongside his family and Lind, had stood outside in their courtyard to greet the young lady's arrival. After a long while, the banners of House von Gratz appeared in the distance. Her family's coat of arms was a divided field of azure and sable in Purbend division. On it, an swan with argent beak, feet, and eyes was emblazoned. It was a truly magnificent and detailed coat of arms, unlike that of the House von Kufstein. Their coat of arms was rudimentary in comparison. It consisted of a Purbend division in sable and or, with an argent bend across its center. It was remarkably similar to the black, white, and red shield decals seen on German helmets in World War I and II during Berengar's previous life, with the exception of the red being replaced by gold. Despite House von Gratz's far more complex design, Berengar felt a certain sense of pride in his own family's banner. It reminded him of his great-grandfather from his previous life, who served in trenches of the Great War as a soldier in the Kaiser's army. After the German Empire's collapse, his family fled the fatherland for greener pastures in America. As Berengar reminisced about his past life, Adela's caravan had arrived inside the courtyard. The moment her luxurious carriage stopped in front of the family, its doors swung open, and the little girl jumped out of the carriage and into Berengar's arms, wrapping around his waist like a spider monkey. The young lord barely had enough time to stabilize himself as he caught a hold of his fiancée, who pecked him on the cheek with her precious lips. "I missed you. Did you miss me?" was the first thing the girl said as she clung to her fiancé in front of his family. While the family was stunned by the outburst, Lind had a pouting expression on her face. Now Berengar's fiancée had arrived, she would have less time with her lord and master to herself. Luckily, everyone was too stunned by Adela's actions to notice Linda's sulking guise. She would have a hard time explaining the look on her face if her fiancé had caught wind of it. After Berengar had pried himself away from the young girl's grasp, he asked her the question which was on everyone's minds. "So, is it all here?" Adela quickly recovered and realized the degree of affection she had just showed Berengar in public. As such, her cheeks quickly flushed with embarrassment. Nevertheless, like a proper noble lady, she calmed her heart and pointed to the servants carrying large crates filled with silver and gold. It was not until all of them piled up did she boldly declare, "My father is a man of his word. The agreed amount of our transaction is in these crates in the form of gold and silver ingots. Count Otto von Gratz wishes to express his thanks for supplying such a large amount of steel and looks forward to future cooperation." Berengar smiled as he ordered a few of his family's servants to check the authenticity of the crates. Though he trusted Adela's words, he was still a cautious man and had each ingot inspected. Only after its worth was confirmed was the mass of gold and steel transferred to the treasury. He now had the ability to invest in the textile industry, expand the capacity of the mines, and by extension, his steel surplus, which would come in handy for the many inventions he had planned. Once the irrigation system was fully in place, he would have many unemployed farmers who could begin work in the mines or the factories. Things were truly going according to his plans. After Adela's arrival, the family threw a feast to celebrate her return. She thoroughly enjoyed the lavish cuisine she had so desperately missed during her absence. Berengar found the young girl's appearance as she devoured the food with a satisfied expression on her doll-like face to be incredibly cute. However, Lind could not help but glare at her rival. Even if she would never be the wife, Lind still did not like to see Berengar show his young fiancé such a different side of himself that he showed to her. Her menacing gaze did not go unnoticed by Adela. She could not understand why Lind disliked her so much. It must be the fact that the two brothers were feuding. After all, it's not as if they were currently fighting for the affection of the same man. After the meal was over, Berengar immediately got to work. Though he wanted to spend the day with Adela, pockets needed to be filled with coins to ensure his engagement ceremony was well supplied, his forces well equipped, and his factories manned. His father would normally handle the investiture into the mines, but the Baron had been delegating more and more responsibility to his son and heir recently. As such, Berengar quickly found himself managing the mines, which worked perfectly for his plans. It also meant that his father was testing him. If he could handle such a monumental task efficiently, he might be able to earn the title Regent. Maybe his father was also aware of the upcoming war and was beginning to make his preparations. For now, Berengar could not know the truth of the matter. Thus he handled his business as best as he could. Supplies were brought in to improve the mines, and blueprints were drafted by mining safety standards and improvements from the industrial era. The last thing Berengar wanted on his hands was a collapsed mine. As such, he practically overhauled the system in place overnight in which the mines had used for centuries. One of these critical inventions was the safety lamp, which would provide adequate lighting in volatile areas where other lamps and candles could be hazardous. Mining was dangerous and backbreaking work. The least Berengar could do was apply safety standards and equipment and an adequate paycheck to compensate the workers for the work hazards that may appear. What would really speed up the process of mining was dynamite. Though he knew the chemical equation to create such a thing, he lacked a knowledgeable chemist and a production facility to manufacture it. He seriously needed to get his hands on an alchemist which he could personally tutor in chemistry, but unfortunately, there was none within a small region like his family's. However, he decided it was better to have a chemical laboratory he could utilize within his spare time than to have no ability to produce chemicals whatsoever. As such, he put aside a small portion of the mining funds to construct a chemical laboratory and the equipment necessary to outfit it. As long as he requested the funding under the guise of miscellaneous mining innovations, his father would approve it. Thus the young lord quickly drafted the plans necessary for such production. Though he had limited spare time nowadays, he needed to produce supplies that required basic chemistry. It was better to have a system in place before he had a proper chemist than a proper chemist and no means of production. While he was in the middle of his work, he heard a knock on his door, which he quickly responded to. After opening the door, he saw his darling little fiancée dressed in a pastel pink velvet gown and a tray of snacks in her hands. She knew her fiancé was busy with work, but she still desired to spend some time with him, even if it was just watching him a snack while he was hard at work. A large German cheesecake sat on the tray which the young girl had begun to divide up into pieces for the couple to consume. After taking a bite from the delicious cheesecake, Berengar could feel a tear forming in his eyes. It was exactly as his mother used to make. After all, it was her recipe that he remembered. Nevertheless, he could not help but feel a sense of longing for his old home. He started to wonder how his family reacted to his death. He had been too busy with work and school in his adult life to visit home often. Eventually, he drifted apart from his family. He began to lament that he had not spent more time with his parents before he passed. It was a shame he was an only child and had perished in Afghanistan. His parents were sure to regret that he had never produced grandchildren for them. As he began to think about his grieving parents with no grandchildren to comfort them, the tears in his eyes began to produce more rapidly, which did not go unnoticed by his loving fiancée, who sat next to him. Adela noticed the tears streaming from Berengar's eyes and tried to comfort him. She had no idea what would cause such a strange reaction. "What's wrong? Are you okay?" Berengar wiped the tears from his eyes and smiled. He felt ashamed of himself for crying in front of a little girl like Adela. Yeah, I'm fine. The taste brings back memories. Adela did not know what memories he could be referring to. As far as she was aware, these recipes were his inventions. They had never been seen before. At this moment, Berengar finally realized he had not answered the girl's question from when she first returned and looked softly into her eyes as he spoke truthfully with her. I did miss you, Adela. I'm sorry I wasn't able to say so earlier. The young lady immediately began to blush as she heard his words. She was not expecting him to say such a thing. For the next half hour, she shared the snacks with Berengar, and by the time they were finished, she was satisfied with the small time she spent with her fiancé. She was finally able to figure out if he felt anything during her weeks of absence. The young girl thought that she was lucky to have such a loving fiancé. If she knew he was cheating on her with his brother's fiancé behind her back, she probably would not have such thoughts. However, she did not know, and Berengar intended to keep it that way. It was best not to have your wife find out about your concubine if you could avoid it. Who knows what reprisal he might face if she were to become aware of his complicated relationship with Lind. So he continued to lie to his little fiancé, and she continued to believe him. After some time, Adela had left Berengar's chambers, and Berengar focused on his work. All of his plans for the mines and the industry he had drafted were either delivered to Ludwig for implementation or sent to his father's desk for approval. The engagement ceremony's plans had been put into action by competent people beneath his father's command, and the family's coffers were filled to the brim. With it, another day's work had come to an end. He sighed heavily as he sat back in his comfy leather chair and watched the moon in the sky above. Any minute now, Lind would knock on his door and beg for attention, and he would spend the rest of his waking hours disciplining her for being so obviously jealous at Adela's arrival. It was good to be a noble scion, even if he was merely a baron's son. Chapter 27 Visiting the Mines. As the rise of dawn awoke Berengar from his slumber, he quickly got dressed and left Lind by her lonesome in his quarters as she still slept. Today would be a hectic day for Berengar as he personally visited the mines to oversee their expansion. He did not even have time to work out this morning. For the next couple of weeks, Berengar would be at the mines near the village of Wildschonau. Wildschonau was currently under the direct control of one of Sieghard's vassals, known as Lord Ulrich von Wildschonau. It was a perfect chance to leave a favorable impression on the minor lord and his family. After all, the rumors of Berengar being a petty, indolent, and sickly young lord were still prominent outside of the town of Kufstein and those who have had direct contact with him. After grabbing a quick snack in which the chefs woke up early to prepare for his journey, Berengar left his family's estate while only leaving a letter to inform them of his absence. He was a man of action, and since he had decided to oversee this venture personally, he would not waste time with parting words, especially since he would only be gone for a few weeks at most. As he stepped into one of his family's carriages and looked back at the window to his room in the tower up above, he could see Linda's heavenly figure gazing down at him as she waved goodbye. Evidently, his absence had awoken the beauty from her precious sleep. Berengar's parting gift to her was the kiss he blew in her direction before stepping into the carriage which swiftly took off from the castle and regrouped with the supply caravan down in the town below. He would travel for several hours before reaching the lordship of Wildschonau. When his caravan arrived, Berengar stepped out of his carriage to greet Lord Ulrich and his family. He had sent a letter in advance to inform the lord of his arrival. As the baron's son and heir, he still had to follow the proper etiquette when approaching his family's vassal territory. After stepping out of his carriage, the expressions on the family's faces went from forcing a gracious smile to deep shock. Berengar had appeared far different from the last time they had met. Though they could not see the extent of his fitness beneath his fine doublet, they could tell that his skin had a healthy glow and that his cheeks were no longer sunken. Evidently, the sickly boy they once knew had recovered from his childhood infirmity. Berengar approached Lord Ulrich, who bowed before him. After all, despite his preconceptions about Berengar as a person, the young lord was still the son of the baron and, as such, held a higher position than him. My lord, it is a great honor to host your stay at our humble abode. Lord Ulrich was a man in his early 30s, and his wife was nearly 10 years younger. They were a young couple, and Ulrich had recently acquired the title of lord from his late father. He was not exceptionally handsome, nor was he sufficiently strong. He was truly an average guy all around, at least from an aesthetic perspective. The man had mid-length dirty blonde hair and ocean blue eyes with a trimmed beard to match his hair color. His skin was not as fair as Berengar's, nor was it as tanned as the commoner's. His wife shared a strikingly similar appearance to Ulrich, and Berengar began to wonder if they were related in some way. In her hands, she held an infant boy, which was the third son of Ulrich. Kneeling next to the couple were another two boys who were in their formative years. The little tykes gazed up at Berengar's with a sense of wonder. This was the first time they had met a family member of the Baron, and they were well aware of the position he held in the household. Berengar motioned for the family to rise as he put on a charming smile. "You honor me with your kind words, Lord Ulrich. I'm merely here on business and will be spending most of my time at the mines. However, I will not turn down the hospitality you have shown me. Be aware that I may otherwise be preoccupied to become acquainted with your fine household fully." Berengar's words were chosen wisely. He did not wish to offend Lord Ulrich or his house, but he also needed to make it clear that he would be swamped overseeing the expansion of the mines. Thus he would not be able to entertain his hosts properly. On the other hand, Lord Ulrich nearly sighed in relief as he heard those words. The last time he had met Berengar, the young lord had acted like a spoiled brat of lower intellect. He wanted to avoid wasting time with such a wastrel if at all given a chance. However, Ulrich was quite shocked by how Berengar was behaving. It was quite different from his old self. Ulrich quickly dismissed his family when Berengar made it clear he wanted to head to the mines as quickly as possible. He personally elected to guide the youth to the mines. If this petty young lord was overseeing the expansion of the mines in which Sieghard had ordered, it was best for him to stay close by and prevent any mishaps. As the two noblemen got into the carriage and departed for the mines, Ulrich could not help but ask about the project. So, what are the plans for expanding the mines? A smile appeared on Berengar's face as he began a long discussion about the new safety standards, which included a more robust support system to prevent mine collapses and the safety lamp. He also demanded proper work hours and sufficient payment, which the Baron would personally take care of. There was also the ban on child labor in the mines, in which Berengar had gotten approval from his father. Eventually, Berengar informed Ulrich that he would be using gunpowder to blast certain areas of the mine open, revealing new veins to extract the ore from. Because he did not have dynamite, Berengar had to use gunpowder and lots of it to expand the mining shafts rapidly. It was a risky move, but he was willing to take it. As long as it was done properly, he could mitigate the risks of the mine collapsing on the workers. Luckily for him, he had been stockpiling black powder for use in his militia. He had an overabundance of it which he felt fearful leaving lying around in his own territory. Thus Berengar had opted to bring quite a lot of it with him to aid in blasting open the mines. After hearing all of Berengar's plans in great detail, the man could not believe that the petty, dull, and indolent young lord he knew years past had come up with such an extensive plan to overhaul the mines. It would take weeks to implement, but if it were done successfully, the productivity of the mines would skyrocket, especially since Berengar brought with him some of the unemployed farmers to act as the additional workforce. Until Berengar could build steam engines and a proper rail system, he would be forced to relocate families to the territory ruled by Lord Ulrich to increase mining productivity. Berengar also handed the lord a set of documents that contained all the details of his four-field system. He would also supply the lordship's fields with enough fertilizer to last the season. However, Berengar had no plans to inform Ulrich about the irrigation system at the moment. Until the fields of Kufstein could properly field the irrigation system itself, he would not lend the knowledge behind its implementation to Ulrich. For now, he wanted to increase crop yields in his vassal's territory, and gifting the four-field system to his vassals posed no major disadvantage. Even if Ulrich leaked it to other regions, the increase in food production throughout Europe as a whole was a good thing. His plans to be the breadbasket of Austria would still come true even if everyone else found out about the four-field system, as that was not his only agricultural innovation that would result in massive growth. When Ulrich looked over the designs of the four-field system, he could not believe his eyes. He had to ask the question on his mind at that moment. You came up with this?" Berengar smiled gracefully when he responded to Ulrich. "I came up with the theory, but I had some help from a good friend testing it. We won't know how effective the results are until this year's harvest. However, I myself and many others are fairly certain there are at the very least no disadvantages to this system." The man could not believe what he was hearing. Berengar had gifted him this information without asking for anything in return. This knowledge would greatly affect his crop yields, and in turn, the income his land would garner. Why would Berengar give this tremendous knowledge away for free? What do you want in return for this information? Berengar continued to smile as he assured the Lord that there was nothing he wanted from exchanging information. There is nothing I want in return for these designs. The more food we produce in our lands, the better it is for everyone and the fewer farmers we need. The unemployed farmers can then be put to work in the mines. I have great plans for the resources those mines contain, and I will need every hand I can get in producing it. Ulrich struggled to believe Berengar was so benevolent. He was truly gifting him this knowledge free of charge, merely so that his commoners were more productive? The Lord had a hard time grasping such a concept. Of course, he had no way of knowing how grand Berengar's plans were for the industrialization of the barony and its vassal territories. As such, he could hardly think of the need for a massive workforce. Ultimately, after some time to think for himself, Ulrich accepted the plans and promised to have the 4-field system and the use of the phosphate fertilizer he had been gifted implemented as soon as possible. I humbly accept the designs and will do my very best to implement them as quickly as I can. Berengar smiled graciously at the man's humble demeanor. Lord Ulrich truly knew his place in this world. A quality he could not say everyone had. After a long conversation about the ongoing changes in Kufstein, the supply caravan finally arrived at the mines where they saw a camp set up outside of its entrance. Many of the miners had a difficult time returning to their families with all the work they were required to do, and as such, had built a shantytown outside of the mine's entrance which the miners referred to as Miner Village. Berengar found himself disgusted by the conditions these poor peasants were forced to live in and vowed that he would at least make some improvements to their temporary housing. After all, with the 40-hour workweek being introduced as one of Berengar's many safety and wellness innovations, they would no longer be forced to work until they dropped from exhaustion. After getting out of the carriage in which the two noblemen had ridden, the miners stood at attention as they noticed the arrival of their lord, who ruled over the territory they found themselves dwelling in. It was sporadic for him to visit the mines, and many men did not react. Berengar, however, was the first to speak. As you were. He had many things to handle in the upcoming weeks and did not have the time to mingle with the locals. Eventually, dozens of men started getting out of the caravan and bringing supplies over to improve the mines. Seeing the handsome and well-dressed men standing next to their lord and giving commands, the miners with more common sense took it to mean that Berengar was their boss's boss and swiftly obeyed his orders and got back to work. Only asking each other and the newcomers about who the man was with the slicked-back golden hair. After several hours the miners became used to Berengar giving commands as he stared at a map of the mines and their current excavation process. It would be a long and arduous journey to get these mines up to code. However, Berengar would be damned if he failed to return in time for his engagement ceremony. As such, he once more burnt the midnight oil. It was not until the whistle blew and the miners returned to their shacks did Berengar finally get some rest. He would work as long as the miners did and lead by example. That was always how he had handled things when in a leadership position and would not change now just because he faced the dangers of the mines. Berengar lied down upon in a makeshift cot under a lean-to shelter as he gazed up the moon and stars above, thinking about his past and present life. Eventually, he fell to sleep thinking about the two lovely girls waiting for his return. Chapter 28 Cave In. By the time dawn arrived, Berengar was already awake and hard at work overseeing the mine's construction. He acted like a true overseer as he issued orders left and right. If one way within the vicinity, he could feel the ground shaking and the sounds of explosions as he commanded the workforce he brought with him to blast their way through the solid portions of rock with gunpowder caskets. The debris was rapidly cleared, and support beams were put in place to prevent a collapse. This was how Berengar spent the entirety of his time during the initial week after his arrival. He would personally go into the mining shafts to inspect the progress several times a day at regular intervals. Berengar had personally led these men through the current overhaul of the mines and had championed their cause for better working conditions. As such, he felt as if he was safe among these hard-working men, for in their eyes was a level of genuine respect rarely afforded to someone of Berengar's status by the common people. It was the same gaze the people of Kufstein gave Berengar every time they laid eyes upon him. Berengar felt happy knowing that he had made a positive impact in the people's lives under his family's dominion. He did not think for 1 second that the people whose lives he had improved would turn on him. After all, who would harm their benefactor? Ulrich had visited the mines several times throughout the week and was amazed by Berengar's progress. If things continued as planned, Berengar would be able to complete the project in a total of 3 weeks, which was slightly over his initial projection. Nevertheless, it gave Berengar ample time to prepare for his upcoming engagement ceremony, in which he had personally handed Ulrich his invitation. Everything seemed to be going as planned, that is, until 3 days after the second week of the project had begun. One afternoon while Berengar was going through one of his regular inspections, he was led rather deeply into the mine by the foreman he had placed in charge. Despite this, he initially did not feel any sense of danger. After all, this man was one of many who had directly benefited from Berengar's labor reformations. By the time Berengar had reached the end of the mine shaft, he had begun to feel a bit suspicious. He had not encountered any miners for the last 300 yards aside from the foreman he traveled with. After coming to a volatile section of the mine shaft, the supervisor turned around while holding onto his safety lamp. The bright flame illuminated the eerie smile that spread across the man's lips as he mouthed the words. "Your brother Lambert sends his regards." As soon as the man said those words, Berengar instantly realized he had been led into a trap. He had been surrounded by allies for far too long and had forgotten a valuable life lesson from his previous life. Greed and avarice will always prevail over good and virtue. As long as the price was right, even the most honorable of men would do the most despicable things. He had no way of knowing it at the time, but this man who under Berengar's guidance had seen his life, and that of his family's vastly improved, had been paid an extensive sum by Lambert to lead Berengar to his death. Before Berengar could react, the man sprinted behind him towards the exit. A second after passing him by, a blast went off, collapsing the tunnel upon the young lord. Then everything went dark. Hours passed before Berengar regained consciousness. He was pinned under a giant stone and had difficulty breathing. His body was aching, and he could feel blood dripping from his forehead. There was no light nor sound, only the feeling of pain reverberating throughout his body. Debris filled the air, causing the young lord to choke as he cursed himself for being foolish enough to follow the man alone into the mine shaft. God fucking damn it, this is what I get for trusting people so easily. After venting out his frustration, Berengar attempted to lift the stone that was lying across his chest. The large stone must have weighed 150 pounds, and under the circumstances, he had a hard time lifting it off of his chest. Luckily for him, he had been using his bench press extensively over the past few months and had made significant gains in that time. Through much effort, he could lift the rock off his chest and slide it to the side, allowing him ample space to breathe. As the young lord looked around to get his bearings straight, he could see very little. However, a few yards away, he could see the light shining through the cavern, which gave him hope. At least there was fresh air circulating through the cut-off region. Hopefully, the others would notice he was missing and send a rescue party. The biggest problem he currently faced was that he had nothing to drink, which meant if the search party could not find him within 3 days, then he was destined to die again, and so shortly after, he had reincarnated in this world. That, of course, was assuming that a search party would be sent after him. After all, if the foreman betrayed him, who's to say the others weren't in on it as well? Things were not looking good for Berengar at the moment. As such, he spent the next 30 minutes looking for an escape route. When he found out that he was well and truly trapped, he could only rely on the grace of God for his salvation. The night after Berengar was trapped in the mineshaft, Lambert opened a letter in his chambers addressed to him by Lord Ulrich von Wildschonau. The contents of the letter were as followed. Dear Lambert, son of Sieghard von Kufstein and the rightful heir to the Barony of Kufstein. With great pleasure, I inform you that your brother has been trapped within a mineshaft and currently has no means of escape. It will only be a matter of days until you are officially recognized as the heir to your family's lands. I congratulate you early on succeeding your father and gaining the title Baron of Kufstein. I will make sure to be at your wedding in the coming months. I trust you know what to do with this letter after you have finished reading it. Sincerely, Ulrich von Wildschonau. After reading the letter, Lambert lit a candle and was about to set it ablaze when Lind walked through the door to his bedchamber. Seeing what the young boy was about to do, She felt as if something had gone terribly wrong and immediately inquired about the details of his latest scheme. "Is that a letter from my father?" Lambert pulled the letter away from the flame and handed it over to Lind with a deeply satisfied smile spread across his lips. "Better, it is a letter from the Lord of Wildschonau informing me that has taken care of our little problem." Lind hardly listened to Lambert's little narration as she studied the contents of the letter. When she read about Berengar's precarious situation, she could not prevent herself from breaking into tears, which Lambert immediately noticed. Confused and suspicious, Lambert got up and approached his fiancée with a concerned facade. "What's wrong? Are you all right?" Finally noticing that she was choking back tears with her free hand over her mouth, Lind began to wipe the tears from her eyes and did her best to reclaim her calmness, despite the wavering of her heart. "Yes, of course, these are tears of joy. We are one step closer to our goal." Lambert, though initially suspicious, ended up believing the heavenly beauty's act. However, before he could further advance their relationship, she tossed the letter and pushed Lambert aside. "If you'll excuse me, I need to write to my father about our success." With that said, Lind rushed out the door. It was only after she was out of sight that she began to break out into tears, which crashed down around her as she ran to the only person she knew who could save Berengar, if he was still alive. That was. Ludwig stood in his shop, operating the trip hammer as he pounded an ingot of high-carbon steel into the form of a sword. Though it had been many years since he last built a sword, it was something he would never forget how to do. The masterpiece's design he was working on was referred to in Berengar's many records as a side sword. A design that would usually not be made for the next 100 years, yet due to the many projects Berengar had spent time designing existed solely in the form of blueprints until now. Initially, when Berengar was started learning swordplay, he wanted a proper sword designed for himself. Though he later scratched the idea, the design still existed within the confines of the old engineer's shop. Ludwig and his team of smiths, engineers, and metalworkers had all banded together to create a wedding present for Berengar. Though it was years away, they rarely had downtime, so after hours, they would spend a little bit of time each day working on their masterpiece to present the young lord as a token of their appreciation for everything he had done in their lives. Here in Kufstein, Lambert had no allies among the common population, and the level of respect they had for Berengar was beyond the means of simple bribery. Everything was calm and quiet on this evening, and only Ludwig was currently still in the shop working on the design of the production of the exquisite sword. Just for Berengar, he had made the weapon out of crucible steel. Due to Berengar's innovations, he created a small crucible furnace solely for the production of fine crucible steel to be used in presentation-grade swords. Crucible steel was not common in European countries in either timeline but was largely used by Eastern civilizations. The variations of which had different names, such as Damascus or Wootz steel. Berengar had always mentioned how beautiful crucible steel swords were and had much desired one for himself, even though he felt the sword would soon become largely ceremonial. While Ludwig was in the process of creating the sword blade, he heard the doors to his shop swing open and immediately looked up at the disturbance. Lind, the heavenly beauty, Lambert's fiancée, was standing in the doorway with tears streaming down her face and a nervous expression as she shouted at Ludwig in a pleading tone. "You have to help him. You have to save Berengar." This perplexed Ludwig, as the man had heard on several occasions when drinking with Berengar that there was a cabal of nobles conspiring against him to remove him from his inheritance, and it was all led by Lambert. He could not understand why Lambert's fiancée would say such a thing and was immediately suspicious. He instantly stopped what he was doing and backed away from the girl who had a crazy expression in her eyes. Help him how? Save him from what? Lind struggled to find the words to say and tried to calm herself down. After several seconds she was able to articulate her thoughts properly. Lambert, he got the Lord of Wildschonau to collapse the mines on top of him. He might be dead already. Ludwig could see the genuine look of concern on the beautiful girl's face and was deeply confused by this. He accidentally let his thoughts slip through his tongue. "You're Lambert's fiancée. Why do you want to save Berengar?" Lind instantly became aware that Ludwig knew about her fiancé's intent to assassinate Berengar and could not come up with an excuse for her actions. As she stared at the old man who was waiting patiently for her answer, she had no choice but to tell the truth. After all, Ludwig was Berengar's dear friend and could be trusted, right? Because I love him." Ludwig heard this and could not help but mumble beneath his breath. Fucking nobles. However, he could tell from the look on her doll-like face that she was telling the truth, and as such, he sighed heavily. "All right, I'll go gather the boys. If he's still alive, we'll save him. If not, well, let's not think about that." With that said, Ludwig rushed off to gather the men and supplies he needed to mount a rescue expedition. If the Lord of Wildschonau was on Lambert's side, then there was no way his own men, the miners, would help in the search for the young lord. He had no hope but to gather as many people as he could as quietly as he could. His first stop was to Eckhard Berengar's second in command of the militia. They needed to be rallied and quickly. If Ulrich were really on Lambert's side, he would not allow excavation to occur, and the rescue force needed an army loyal to Berengar to protect them in case things turned bloody. If he reported this matter to Sigurd, he would need proof to obtain his help. Even if he could convince the Baron, it would become a political battle between a Baron and his vassal. By the time help arrived, the young lord would be dead. When Eckhard heard the news from Ludwig, he did not hesitate to muster the militia. By midnight, an army of 600 men and 6 cannons were on the march to the lordship of Wildschonau, alongside the hundreds of volunteers whose aim was to rescue Berengar. Just as the young lord was about to lose faith in the bonds he had sewn with the commoners, they would reward him in a greater capacity than he could ever ask of them.